Hey everyone, today we're stepping into a 1960s American kitchen, where a pound of ground beef sat beside a chipped mixing bowl, a sleeve of crackers, a bottle of ketchup and a loaf pan polished dull from years of use. The dinner on the calendar was meatloaf, but the real trick was not simply shaping meat into a pan. It was making that pan feed everyone at the table. For many families, especially those watching the grocery budget, meatloaf was less a single recipe than a quiet household strategy. Oats breadcrumbs, torn bread, or crushed crackers could make the mixture larger, softer, and easier to slice into neat portions. The smell of onion and tomato topping drifted through the kitchen, and by the time the loaf reached the table, it looked reassuringly solid. 1 pound had become dinner for 5, 6, or sometimes more. That was the promise of this list, not meals that looked poor, but meals that knew exactly how far they needed to go. If you enjoy remembering the foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that once filled American homes, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which inexpensive 1960s dinner do you remember most clearly? And did your family stretch meatloaf with oats, breadcrumbs, crackers, or something else entirely? For this list, a cheap dinner is not simply a low-priced dish. It is a meal that stretched costly ingredients, used pantry staples, reduced waste, and placed enough food on the table to satisfy a household. Meatloaf earned the first place because it did all four while still arriving with the appearance of a proper main course. It could be sliced, it could be served with gravy, it could sit between mashed potatoes and canned green beans as though the family had planned something grander than arithmetic. The arithmetic was still there, of course. It was simply hidden beneath a glossy stripe of ketchup. The mixing bowl told the real story. Ground beef went in first, followed by whatever the kitchen kept for stretching and binding. In one home that meant dry breadcrumbs shaken from a tin. In another it meant yesterday's bread softened with milk. Some cooks used rolled oats, while others crushed saltine crackers by hand, leaving a few uneven pieces that disappeared during baking. An egg helped hold everything together. Chopped onion supplied flavour and milk tomato juice, or a little sauce kept the loaf from becoming dry. The exact combination varied by region, income, family habit, and whatever remained in the pantry that week. That flexibility was part of meatloaf's strength. It did not demand a special trip to the store. It accepted substitutions with remarkable dignity. Even the shape helped. Packed into a loaf pan or formed by hand in a shallow baking dish, the mixture looked larger and more deliberate than loose ground beef in a skillet. A loaf suggested order. It also made portion control seem like serving. When the oven door opened, the kitchen filled with the smell of browned meat, cooked onion, and sweet tomato glaze. Grease gathered along the edges of the pan and the top darkened where ketchup or tomato sauce had caramelized. Some families added brown sugar or mustard. Others preferred a plain top and saved gravy for the plate. The loaf needed a few minutes to rest before slicing a practical pause that could feel very long to children already seated at the table. Then came the careful cut. Too thick and the last person might receive only a narrow end piece. Too thin and the slices could break apart before reaching the platter. An experienced cook learned to judge the loaf almost instantly, dividing it into portions while appearing not to count at all. Mashed potatoes made the plate look full. A vegetable added colour. Bread or rolls stood nearby in case anyone remained hungry. No one announced that the meal had been engineered for maximum reach. The serving spoon and the bread basket handled that conversation quietly. The economy continued after dinner. A loaf that survived the first meal could return in several forms, and this mattered as much as the original recipe. Cold slices went between bread with mustard or ketchup for a work lunch. Crumbled leftovers could be warmed in gravy folded into hash, or added to a skillet with potatoes and onions. Some families deliberately made a larger loaf because the second meal was part of the plan. Others guarded the remaining slices from children searching the refrigerator after school. Meatloaf was especially useful because it reheated without losing its identity. A casserole might collapse into an unrecognizable spoonful, but a slice of meatloaf still looked like a serving. The dish also allowed home cooks to use small amounts of ingredients that might otherwise be wasted: a heel of bread, half an onion, a little milk, several crackers at the bottom of a sleeve. Nothing seemed important on its own. Together, those scraps became structure. In a budget kitchen, structure was often the difference between ingredients and dinner. Of course, not every child admired meatloaf with the same enthusiasm as the adults who balanced the grocery money. A dark edge, a visible onion, or an unexpected piece of green pepper could cause immediate suspicion. Some loaves were tender and savoury. Others were so firm that the slice could survive a fall from the table with little visible damage. That variation is one reason the memory remains so strong. People do not simply remember meatloaf. They remember their family's meatloaf, the glaze, the pan the side dishes, the end piece their father preferred, or the slice their mother saved for tomorrow's sandwich. Behind those details was an ordinary act of household skill. Someone had taken the most expensive ingredient in the bowl and surrounded it with enough inexpensive support to feed everyone without making the meal feel like a compromise. The loaf pan made £1 look generous. On the next shelf of the pantry, a can of tuna and a bag of noodles were waiting to perform the same trick in a completely different dish. A wide glass casserole dish waited on the counter beside a bag of egg noodles. 2 small cans of tuna, a can of condensed soup, and a bowl of frozen or canned peas. Nothing in that arrangement looked especially impressive on its own. The noodles were pale and ordinary. The tuna came packed into compact cans that disappeared easily behind taller pantry goods. The soup had been designed to become lunch with the addition of water, yet in many 1960s kitchens it was asked to perform a more ambitious duty. Stirred together, those modest ingredients became tuna noodle casserole, one of the decade's most recognizable budget dinners. It was soft, creamy filling and forgiving enough to survive substitutions. A family could prepare it without buying a roast, trimming a chicken, or spending the afternoon beside the stove. The casserole dish did most of the presenting. Once the top browned and the edges began to bubble, pantry ingredients acquired the appearance of a planned family meal. The noodles supplied the bulk. They were boiled until tender, though not always with the precision modern recipes might request, then drained in a metal colander that sent a cloud of steam toward the kitchen window. The tuna was opened with a manual or electric can opener, drained and separated with a fork. Condensed soup became the sauce, sometimes loosened with milk, and sometimes used nearly as it came from the can. Peas added colour, at least in theory. Children who distrusted anything green often treated each pea as an individual negotiation. Some cooks added chopped celery, onion, mushrooms, or pimentos. Others kept the dish plain because plain was what the family would eat. The ingredients were folded together in the same bowl or directly in the baking dish, reducing the number of dishes but not eliminating them. Convenience in the 1960s generally meant fewer steps, not the disappearance of work. Someone still boiled, opened, drained, stirred, baked, served, and washed the casserole dish afterward. Its real economy came from proportion. Tuna provided the recognizable protein and the unmistakable smell, but noodles occupied most of the dish. The soup coated every piece, spreading the flavor of the tuna far beyond the amount actually used. A cook could add more noodles if another child was expected at the table, or slightly less tuna if the grocery money had already been claimed by milk bread and school lunches. The casserole accepted these adjustments without complaint. It could also absorb leftovers. A spoonful of peas from the previous night, a little shredded cheese, Several mushrooms or the final crumbs in a cracker box could all find a place. There was rarely a need to explain why the recipe had changed. Tuna noodle casserole was expected to vary from kitchen to kitchen, and sometimes from week to week in the same home. The written recipe might occupy one stained index card, but the actual method depended on what the pantry was willing to surrender. Then came the topping the part that transformed a pale mixture into something worthy of the dinner table. Crushed crackers were common, especially when mixed with a little melted butter. Breadcrumbs could be used just as easily. Some families scattered potato chips over the surface, creating a salty crust that seemed festive, despite being assembled from the bottom of a bag. Others added grated cheese or simply baked the casserole uncovered until the noodles at the edges became crisp. That contrast mattered. Beneath the topping, the casserole was soft enough to be eaten with very little effort. Above it, the crumbs provided a brief crackle under the serving spoon. The kitchen smelled of warm tuna toasted starch and condensed soup. It was not a delicate aroma, and it had a way of announcing dinner before anyone was called. For viewers who grew up with the dish, that smell may still summon a Formica table aluminum tumblers, and a parent carrying the hot casserole with folded dish towels. Tuna noodle casserole also belonged to a broader change in American home cooking. Supermarket shelves offered more canned, boxed, and frozen ingredients, while magazines, recipe booklets, and food advertisements encouraged home cooks to combine them into quick family meals. The promise was modern efficiency. A can could replace a sauce that once required more measuring and stirring. Frozen vegetables could wait until needed. Dried noodles remained ready on the shelf. Yet the resulting meal still followed an older expectation. Dinner should arrive, hot feed everyone, and resemble something made at home. The casserole solved that contradiction neatly. It used industrially prepared ingredients but required enough mixing, seasoning, and judgment to feel personal. One family added extra pepper. Another used 2 cans of tuna because that was how a grandmother had made it. A third left out the peas to preserve domestic peace. Packaged food created the framework, but household habits supplied the final recipe. At the table, the casserole was usually served in generous spoonfuls rather than precise slices. It spread slightly across the plate, settling beside canned fruit, a lettuce salad, or buttered bread. Its softness made it easy for younger children, while its richness helped adults feel that the meal had substance. Leftovers could be covered and placed in the refrigerator, where the noodles absorbed even more sauce by the following day. Reheated portions were sometimes drier, sometimes firmer, and often eaten for lunch without ceremony. The dish has never completely vanished, but it no longer occupies the same central place in family cooking. Changing tastes, fresh ingredient preferences, takeout, faster frozen meals, and different household schedules pushed it away from many weekly menus. Still, the memory remains powerful because tuna noodle casserole represented the confidence that one pantry shelf could produce dinner. Across the kitchen, ground beef was about to make its own claim, first on a pile of hamburger buns and then in a pot of elbow macaroni and tomatoes. A pound of ground beef could take 2 very different routes through a 1960s kitchen. On one evening, it might be broken apart in a skillet darkened at the edges and stirred into a sweet tomato sauce before being spooned over soft hamburger buns. On another, the same amount of meat could disappear into a deep pot of elbow macaroni onions and canned tomatoes until no one could tell where the beef ended and the starch began. Sloppy Joes and American goulash shared the same practical genius. Neither dish tried to place a large piece of meat in front of every person. Instead, the meat was crumbled, seasoned, and distributed so thoroughly that each bite contained enough flavor to feel complete. Ground beef was still the star, but it had learned to share the stage with bread, pasta sauce, and whatever else the pantry could contribute. For Sloppy Joes, the work began with the hiss of beef hitting a hot skillet. A wooden spoon or metal spatula pressed the meat into smaller pieces, while chopped onion softened beside it. Some cooks added green pepper celery, or a little garlic depending on family taste and what remained in the refrigerator. The excess grease might be poured into an old can kept near the stove, then the sauce ingredients went in. Tomato sauce ketchup or canned tomato paste provided the base. Mustard vinegar, brown sugar Worcestershire sauce, or a pinch of seasoning adjusted the balance between sweet and tangy. Packaged sauces and seasoning mixes were becoming familiar options, but many families still built the mixture from bottles already standing in the refrigerator door. There was no requirement for elegance. The final filling needed to be thick enough to stay on the bun for at least a few seconds. After that, gravity and childhood enthusiasm usually took control. The economics of the dish were easy to understand. A small hamburger patty announced exactly how much meat each person received. Sloppy Joe filling concealed that calculation. The sauce added volume and the buns provided the weight that made the meal satisfying. If more people appeared at the table, the cook could increase the tomato sauce, chop another onion, or stretch the mixture with finely diced vegetables. Some households added a little oatmeal or breadcrumbs, while others relied entirely on sauce and careful serving. The skillet could be placed directly on the stove while each bun was filled, allowing the cook to judge portions as dinner progressed. Potato chips, pickles, carrot sticks, canned corn or coleslaw often completed the plate. Children usually approved because the sandwich was sweet soft and nearly impossible to eat neatly. The name gave everyone fair warning. A Sloppy Joe was not expected to preserve shirts, tablecloths, or personal dignity. The strongest memory may be the bun itself growing darker as the sauce soaked into the bottom half. The first bite squeezed, filling out the opposite side, and a spoon was often needed to recover what had fallen onto the plate. Paper napkins disappeared quickly. Younger children might receive an open-faced version that could be attacked with a fork, while older children were allowed to test their coordination. For the person who cooked it, Sloppy Joes offered something more valuable than neatness. The meal was fast, flexible, and difficult to ruin. The filling could remain warm in the skillet while a late working parent came through the door. Leftovers reheated easily, and sometimes tasted better after the sauce had settled overnight. The dish could feed a family on an ordinary Tuesday without requiring the oven a long simmer or an expensive cut of meat. It was casual food, but casual did not mean careless. Someone still had to make 1 pound reach the final bun. Elbow macaroni offered ground beef an even greater opportunity to disappear into abundance. American goulash, also known in some regions and households by names such as macaroni and beef or American chop suey, was not the same as the Hungarian stew from which the familiar word had travelled. The American version was usually a practical one-pot combination of browned beef, onions, tomatoes, and macaroni. Some cooks boiled the pasta separately and stirred it in near the end. Others cooked everything together so the noodles absorbed the seasoned tomato liquid. Bell pepper, garlic, paprika, chili powder, or dried herbs might appear, but the basic structure remained forgiving. A can of whole tomatoes could be broken apart with a spoon. Tomato sauce could be added when the pot needed more moisture. A little cheese might melt over the top, although many families served it exactly as it came from the stove red sauce clinging to pale curved noodles. Goulash stretched ground beef more efficiently than almost any sandwich could. Macaroni was inexpensive, easy to store, and capable of turning a modest skillet of meat into a heavy pot that produced second helpings. The noodles collected small pieces of beef, onion, and tomato, making every spoonful taste as though it contained more meat than it actually did. For a large family, this mattered. A cook could add another handful of macaroni without changing the character of the dish. Bread and butter might appear beside it, not because the pot lacked starch, but because bread was a familiar answer whenever someone asked whether there was enough. The meal also reduced cleanup. 1 pot, 1 spoon, and a stack of bowls could replace several pans and serving dishes. That advantage became especially important on school nights, when homework, baths, laundry, and the evening news were all waiting their turn. The sound of the serving spoons scraping the bottom of the pot told the family how successful the calculation had been. If only sauce remained, everyone had eaten well. If a bowlful survived, it could be covered and placed in the refrigerator for lunch or tomorrow's dinner. Reheated goulash became softer and thicker as the macaroni absorbed more liquid, but that rarely reduced its usefulness. Some children preferred it the second day. Others objected to any meal that returned wearing the same clothes. Together, Sloppy Joes and American goulash showed how 1960s home cooks treated ground beef not as a finished portion, but as a flavour that could be spread across an entire meal. 1 pound travelled through buns, tomato sauce, onions, and macaroni until it reached every person at the table. But ground beef was not the only ingredient capable of stretching. In the next kitchen, one chicken was about to surrender its flavour to a deep pot of broth and a soft blanket of dumplings. A whole chicken settled into a deep pot beside an onion, several celery stalks, and enough water to cover everything. The lid rattled softly as steam escaped, carrying the smell of broth through the kitchen and down the hallway. In many 1960s, Holmes chicken and dumplings began not with neatly packaged boneless pieces, but with a bird that had to be divided, simmered, cooled, and carefully picked from the bones. The chicken provided the flavour, but the dumplings made the meal large enough for the whole family. Flour-shortening milk and broth were less expensive than another bird, and once they swelled inside the pot, the surface seemed almost crowded. This was the quiet arithmetic of the dish. The meat appeared in modest pieces while the broth and dumplings filled bowls generously. No one needed to receive an entire breast or leg. Everyone received some chicken, plenty of gravy-like broth, and enough soft dough to make the spoon feel heavy. The first stage required patience. As the chicken simmered, the water slowly changed into broth, taking on the flavour of the skin, bones, and vegetables. A layer of steam clouded the kitchen window, and the refrigerator motor seemed unusually loud during the pauses between bubbles. When the meat became tender, it was lifted onto a platter, or into a large bowl to cool. Then came the work that rarely appeared in the finished presentation. Fingers separated meat from bone, searched for small pieces of cartilage, and removed skin according to family preference. The best pieces might be saved for serving, while smaller scraps returned to the pot, where they could spread through several bowls. Nothing about the process was difficult, but it took time and attention. A chicken did not become dinner by simply entering the kitchen. Someone had to turn it into broth meat and portions, usually while preparing vegetables, setting the table, and answering questions from children who had already smelled supper. The dumplings revealed where the family came from, what the cook had learned, and what kind of texture everyone expected. In some southern and rural traditions, the dough was rolled thin, cut into strips or squares, and dropped into the simmering broth. These dumplings became tender and slightly slippery, closer to thick noodles than biscuits. In other households, spoonfuls of soft dough were placed on top of the bubbling liquid, where they puffed into pale mounds with fluffy interiors. Both styles stretched the chicken, but they created very different memories. One family remembered a rolling pin dusted with flour and long strips drying briefly on the counter. Another remembered rounded dumplings expanding beneath the lid until they seemed capable of lifting it. Opening the pot too soon could cause concern whether or not the danger was as serious as family tradition suggested. Dumplings came with rules, and every experienced cook appeared to know exactly which rule someone else was about to break. As the dumplings cooked, the broth thickened. Flour from the dough softened the liquid into something between soup and gravy, helping the flavour cling to every spoonful. Some cooks added milk for richness. Others relied entirely on the chicken broth and a little flour. Black pepper appeared generously in certain kitchens, while salt was adjusted only after the dumplings had finished absorbing the seasoned liquid. Carrots, peas, or celery might remain in the final pot, although many versions were almost entirely cream-coloured pale dumplings, pale chicken, pale broth, and perhaps a dark scattering of pepper. The dish did not need visual drama. Its attraction was warmth and weight. A bowl of chicken and dumplings cooled, slowly releasing steam each time the spoon broke into a dumpling. The outside was slick with broth, while the centre could be fluffy dense or pleasantly chewy. The family might disagree about which texture was correct. They rarely disagree that the largest dumpling should somehow belong to them. The meal's economy depended on allowing the entire chicken to contribute. The bones flavoured the broth. Small pieces of meat that looked insignificant on a cutting board became valuable once distributed through the pot. Flour transformed liquid into something that could satisfy hunger. If the household was large, more dumplings could be added. If the chicken was small, the meat could be shredded more finely. Bread was usually unnecessary, though some families served it anyway because a dinner table without bread could look unfinished. Leftovers thickened overnight in the refrigerator as the dumplings continued to absorb broth. The next day the dish might require a splash of water or milk during reheating, but it remained filling and familiar. In households where food waste was taken seriously, even the cooking liquid had a purpose. What might have been discarded in another meal became the foundation of this one. Chicken and dumplings also carried a different feeling from the fast skillet dinners appearing in many 1960s kitchens. Sloppy joes could be assembled quickly, and tuna casserole relied heavily on pantry convenience. Chicken and dumplings moved at the pace of simmering bones and cooling meat. It represented an older cooking rhythm that continued beside boxed mixes, canned soups, and frozen foods. For some families it was a Sunday meal. For others it was reserved for cold weather illness, visiting relatives, or any evening when comfort mattered more than appearance. The dish was inexpensive, but it did not feel spare. A full pot suggested abundance even when the actual amount of meat was modest. That was its great household talent. One chicken entered the kitchen, but broth flour and patient hands allowed it to leave as a meal for everyone. As the last dumpling disappeared beneath the ladle, another kind of economical supper waited nearby: a pot of beans, a skillet of cornbread, and perhaps several hot dogs ready to make canned beans feel like the main event. A pot of beans could occupy the back burner for most of the day without demanding much attention, yet its smell gradually took possession of the entire house. Dried beans had been sorted across the kitchen table, where small stones or shriveled pieces were picked out by hand, then rinsed and soaked before cooking. Into the pot went water, onion, salt, and whatever seasoning the household could spare. A ham hock, a strip of salt pork bacon drippings, or a small piece of leftover ham might provide flavour, but meat was not required in large amounts. That was the point. Beans absorbed the smoky taste and carried it through dozens of spoonfuls. Beside the stove, a cast-iron skillet or square baking pan waited for cornbread batter. By dinner time, beans and cornbread could feed a crowded table from ingredients that cost far less than individual portions of meat. The meal was plain, but plain did not mean careless. Timing, seasoning, and family tradition determined whether the pot became merely edible, or the dinner everyone hoped would leave enough for tomorrow. Beans and cornbread appeared in many American households, but the details varied widely by region, community, and family background. Pinto beans were common in parts of the South and Southwest. Navy beans, Great Northern beans, lima beans, Black-eyed peas and other varieties appeared elsewhere according to local custom and availability. Some cooks wanted a thick pot liquor that coated the spoon. Others preferred more broth, especially when cornbread would be crumbled directly into the bowl. In one kitchen, the cornbread was lightly sweetened. In another, adding sugar was treated as a serious misunderstanding of the entire subject. Some families baked it thin and crisp in a hot greased skillet, while others poured the batter into a deeper pan for soft cake-like squares. These differences mattered because inexpensive meals often carried the strongest rules. When ingredients were simple, technique and memory became the family signature. A child might forget the brand of canned vegetables served beside dinner, but remember forever whether the cornbread crust crackled when broken open. The meal stretched because each part supported the other. Beans supplied protein and substance, while cornmeal turned a bowl into a complete supper. The bread could be buttered, dipped into the broth, or broken into pieces until it absorbed nearly every drop. Chopped onion relish, greens, fried potatoes, or sliced tomatoes might appear alongside the pot when available. In some homes, the beans were served from the same vessel in which they had cooked, its sides darkened from years of use. The cornbread arrived wrapped in a towel or cut into wedges directly from the skillet. Serving portions did not require delicate measurement. A ladleful of beans and a large square of bread could be followed by another if anyone remained hungry. That generosity was possible because the meal's least expensive ingredients created most of its volume. A small amount of pork flavored the pot rather than occupying the center of the plate. Nothing pretended to be steak. Instead, the dinner relied on warmth, salt, smoke, and the confidence that a full bowl would quiet a full table. The practical advantages continued beyond the first evening. A pot of beans often improved after resting as the broth thickened and the seasoning settled. Leftovers could be reheated with a little water mashed and fried, spooned over bread, or served beside another meal. Cornbread that had dried slightly might be crumbled into milk used beneath beans, or incorporated into another family dish rather than discarded. For households far from large supermarkets, dried beans also had the advantage of waiting patiently in the pantry. They required no freezer space and little packaging. The trade-off was time. Beans needed soaking or long cooking, and someone had to remember them before dinner was already overdue. Older beans could remain stubbornly firm. Too much salt added at the wrong moment was blamed in some kitchens, while in others the water, the bean variety, or simple bad luck took responsibility. A supposedly easy pot could test a cook's patience for hours. Economical food was rarely effortless food. It was economical because someone supplied the planning. Franks and Beans offered a faster, more packaged version of the same basic idea. Instead of sorting and soaking dried beans, a cook could open several cans, pour them into a saucepan or casserole dish, and slice hot dogs directly into the mixture. The beans provided bulk, sauce, and sweetness. The frankfurters supplied visible pieces of meat each round slice, giving children the satisfaction of finding something recognizable on the spoon. Some versions included brown sugar mustard ketchup, molasses onion, or a little bacon. Others required nothing beyond the can and the package. The dish could simmer on the stovetop or bake until the sauce thickened around the edges. It was especially useful on busy evenings during summer meals, or when grocery supplies had narrowed to what remained in the pantry and refrigerator. A single hot dog served alone looked like one serving. Cut into coins and distributed through beans, it seemed to multiply. The knife had not created more meat, but it had created more appearances of meat, which was often close enough at dinner time. Children generally found Franks and Beans easier to accept than a pot of plain dried beans. The sauce was often sweet, the texture was soft, and the hot dog pieces could be counted traded or quietly searched for beneath the surface. Bread toast or cornbread stretched the meal further. Some families served it with coleslaw or pickles, while others placed the saucepan directly on the table beside a stack of bowls. The smell of warmed canned beans and frankfurters was unmistakable, carrying the atmosphere of a quick Saturday supper, a camping meal recreated indoors, or the final dinner before grocery day. It was not a dish designed to impress company. It was designed to prevent anyone from leaving hungry. That distinction gave it lasting value. The meal could be assembled quickly by a tired parent, an older child learning to cook, or anyone faced with several hungry people and very little time. Convenience had entered the bean pot, but the old household purpose remained unchanged. Together, beans and cornbread and franks and beans showed two sides of economical 1960s cooking. One meal depended on soaking, simmering, and traditions carried through generations. The other depended on cans packages and the growing supermarket promise that dinner could be assembled more quickly. Both relied on the same principle: let beans provide the body of the meal, and use a small amount of meat or bread to make the table feel complete. Neither experience was universal, and each household seasoned the pot according to its own history. Yet many families remember the sound of a ladle striking the rim, the crust of cornbread breaking beneath a knife, or hot dog slices floating in thick brown sauce. The bean pot could remain on the stove and continue feeding people long after the first bowls were cleared. At the next dinner, however, the family would find its starch in a different form. A mound of mashed potatoes waited on the plate, ready to receive a pan of hamburger gravy and make a small amount of beef spread to every edge. A skillet of browned hamburger did not look capable of feeding a large family until flour milk broth and a wooden spoon began changing the calculation. The meat was broken into small crumbles seasoned with salt, pepper, and perhaps a little onion, then pushed through a pale sauce until every spoonful carried some of its flavor. On another burner, peeled potatoes softened in a dented saucepan waiting to be mashed with milk, margarine, butter, or whatever richness the kitchen could afford that week. Together they became hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes, a dinner built around the useful fact that gravy could travel much farther than meat. 1 pound of beef might not provide a satisfying patty for every person at the table, but once it was scattered through a full pan of gravy and poured over a mound of potatoes, the meal looked abundant. The potatoes supplied weight. The sauce supplied warmth. The hamburger supplied enough flavor to persuade everyone that meat remained at the center of dinner. The potatoes usually required more labor than their modest appearance suggested. They had to be carried from a paper sack, scrubbed, peeled, cut into similar pieces, and boiled until a fork entered without resistance. The water was drained into the sink, sending steam toward the window, and the potatoes were beaten with a hand masher or electric mixer. Some families preferred them smooth and soft. Others accepted small lumps as proof that real potatoes had been involved. Milk loosened the mixture, while butter, margarine, bacon drippings, or a spoonful of evaporated milk might add richness. The bowl had to be large because mashed potatoes were expected to occupy serious territory on the plate. A shallow well was sometimes pressed into the center with the back of a spoon, creating a small reservoir for gravy. Children could be remarkably interested in the engineering of this reservoir. If the walls broke too soon, the gravy escaped toward the vegetables, where it might come into contact with peas. That was an event some young diners considered entirely preventable. The gravy began after the hamburger had browned and released its fat. Depending on the amount left in the skillet, the cook might drain some away or use it as the base for the sauce. Flour was stirred into the meat and drippings coating the crumbles and removing the raw taste as it cooked. Then liquid was added gradually. Milk created a creamy version, while broth, water, or a combination produced a darker, more savory pan. Some cooks added a small amount of canned soup or evaporated milk, but the basic method needed no elaborate ingredient list. The important work happened with the spoon. Stir too little, and the flour might form lumps. Add the liquid too quickly, and the sauce could become thin in one place and stubbornly thick in another. Add too much, and the gravy lost its authority. Add too little, and it could not reach every plate. An experienced cook adjusted by sight, knowing that the sauce would thicken further as it simmered and again as it cooled on the potatoes. This meal often belonged to homes where the grocery budget favoured flexible ingredients. Potatoes were filling, easy to combine with other foods, and capable of making a modest serving of meat feel complete. Flour and milk were already present for baking breakfast or other sauces. Ground beef could be purchased in a larger package, divided, wrapped in wax paper or foil, and reserved for several different dinners. Hamburger gravy also accepted small changes without becoming a different meal. Chopped onion could make the skillet more savoury. Mushrooms, if available and welcomed by the family, added texture. Leftover vegetables could be warmed on the side, while bread ensured that no gravy remained on the plate. In some households, the sauce was spooned over toast biscuits, rice, or noodles instead of potatoes. The method mattered more than the exact foundation. A small amount of browned meat was suspended in enough sauce to cover an inexpensive starch, and the starch carried the meal the rest of the way. At the table, the serving process revealed how carefully the dinner had been designed. Potatoes went onto the plate first, usually in a scoop generous enough to reassure everyone. The gravy followed, carrying small pieces of beef across the white surface. A spoonful of canned green beans, peas, corn, or carrots supplied colour along the edge. The cook could control the distribution of meat without making the portions appear measured. A child who found only 2 visible crumbles might stir the gravy, hopefully convinced that several more were hiding below. An adult understood that the real satisfaction came from the combination. The sauce softened the potatoes, the pepper cut through the richness, and the warm plate delivered the kind of heaviness that made second helpings unnecessary for at least a few minutes. It was not a meal designed for photographs. By the time the gravy had spread and the potatoes had collapsed, the plate looked thoroughly lived in. That was part of its purpose. Hamburger gravy also made good use of the small, irregular amount of meat that sometimes remained after another meal. A leftover patty could be crumbled into the skillet. Scraps from browned beef could be combined with fresh onion and sauce. If the gravy was too thin to feel substantial, more flour or a little extra potato on each plate solved the problem. Leftovers from the finished dinner could be refrigerated and reheated, although mashed potatoes often stiffened overnight and needed additional milk. The gravy might become almost solid when cold, then loosen again over low heat. Nothing about the second serving was elegant, but elegance had never been the assignment. The meal's job was to turn basic ingredients into enough warm food for everyone, and it performed that job with very little waste. Even the final streaks of gravy could be collected with bread, leaving plates nearly clean before they reached the sink. For many people, the memory of hamburger gravy is tied less to a formal recipe than to the sound of the masher in the pot, the smell of pepper rising from the skillet, and the sight of a parent deciding whether the gravy would stretch to one more plate. The dish was inexpensive because potatoes, flour, and liquid did most of the physical work. It was satisfying because the meat flavoured all of them. It also revealed a skill that appeared repeatedly in 1960s family cooking, the ability to make the expensive ingredient present without requiring it to be plentiful. Gravy was asked to feed everyone, and with enough potatoes beneath it, it usually succeeded. The next supper would approach the same problem without a large piece of meat at all. A can of salmon, a stack of crackers, and a bowl of macaroni were waiting to prove that crisp patties and browned cheese could fill the table just as effectively. A small can of salmon sat beside a sleeve of crackers, an egg, and a heavy skillet heating on the stove. Across the kitchen elbow, macaroni drained in a metal colander, while milk warmed for a cheese sauce. Neither dinner required an expensive roast, a thick pork chop, or a separate piece of meat for every person. Salmon patties and baked macaroni and cheese solved the budget problem in different ways, but both understood the value of shape. A mound of canned fish became several round patties, each one crisp enough to look like an individual main course. A few cups of macaroni disappeared beneath sauce and crumbs, then emerged from the oven as a bubbling casserole substantial enough to stand at the centre of the table. These were not merely side dishes pressed into emergency service. In many families they were familiar suppers with their own rules, preferred textures and dependable companions. A plate might include peas, stewed tomatoes, applesauce or sliced bread, but the central promise remained simple. Everyone would receive something hot, recognizable, and filling without the grocery bill depending on a costly cut of meat. Salmon patties began with the turn of a can opener and the unmistakable smell of canned fish escaping into the room. The salmon was emptied into a mixing bowl and separated with a fork. Depending on the product and the cook, small bones and pieces of skin might be removed, crushed into the mixture, or handled according to long-established family preference. Crackers, breadcrumbs, cornmeal, or leftover bread added bulk and helped absorb moisture. An egg bound everything together, while onion, pepper, parsley, or a squeeze of lemon might supply additional flavour. The mixture was divided by hand and pressed into patties, an act that made one can appear far more generous than it had on the pantry shelf. The cook could form 4 large patties or 6 smaller ones, depending on how many chairs surrounded the table. If an unexpected guest or hungry teenager appeared, the patties became thinner and the side dishes became more ambitious. Few families announced this adjustment. The skillet simply received a new arrangement. When the patties met hot fat, their edges began to brown, and the kitchen filled with a savoury smell that was stronger than the amount of fish might suggest. A spatula slid underneath carefully, because the first turn could decide whether the patty remained intact or returned to the pan as seasoned salmon crumbs. The outside became crisp, while the centre stayed soft and moist. Some families served the patties with white sauce, cream, gravy, lemon wedges, mustard, or ketchup. Others placed them beside mashed potatoes and peas without further ceremony. The dish carried both thrift and a small sense of occasion. Unlike tuna folded invisibly into a casserole, each salmon patty arrived as its own portion. Children could count them. Adults could divide them. The cook could place one on every plate and know immediately whether the arithmetic had worked. A second patty might be offered only after everyone had been served, a rule that needed no written explanation. The meal looked organised even when its ingredients had been assembled from the pantry, because the refrigerator offered very little encouragement. The economy of salmon patties reached beyond the fish itself. Crackers or crumbs expanded the mixture, while potatoes, bread, or vegetables supplied most of the meal's weight. Canned salmon waited on the shelf until needed, and did not require freezer space, making it useful in homes where shopping trips were less frequent or refrigeration was limited. Yet the dish was not identical across the country. Coastal families, rural households, working-class kitchens, and communities with strong fish traditions might prepare it differently or use another name. Some cooks remembered patties formed with cornmeal, others insisted on saltines. Some wanted crisp, thin cakes, while others preferred thick patties with a softer centre. The differences were part of the memory. People often remember not just eating salmon patties, but watching a mother or grandmother judge the mixture by touch, adding one more crushed cracker because it seemed too wet. No measuring cup could replace that small movement of experience. Baked macaroni and cheese approached the meatless supper from the opposite direction. Instead of making a small amount of protein look divided and complete, it made starch feel rich enough that meat was not greatly missed. The macaroni was boiled, drained, and poured into a greased casserole dish. In some kitchens, a white sauce began with butter or margarine flour and milk before grated cheese was stirred in. In others, layers of macaroni cheese milk and seasoning were assembled directly in the dish. The exact cheese depended on price availability and family taste. Sharp cheese produced a stronger flavour from a smaller amount, while milder cheese created the smooth, familiar taste many children preferred. A few cooks added dry mustard, evaporated milk egg, or a sprinkle of paprika. Others trusted macaroni milk and cheese to settle the matter without further discussion. The casserole went into the oven pale and loose, then returned with browned edges and a surface that could range from creamy to nearly firm enough to cut into squares. The top supplied much of the drama. Breadcrumbs toasted beneath the oven, heat-crushed crackers formed a buttery crust, or extra cheese darkened in small golden patches. Along the sides of the dish, several noodles became crisp and chewy pieces that often attracted more competition than the soft centre. A serving spoon broke through the crust and lifted a heavy portion onto the plate, trailing strands of melted cheese if the casserole had been served immediately. Baked macaroni and cheese could accompany ham or meatloaf, but on budget nights it needed no supporting meat. Green beans, canned tomatoes, cabbage or fruit completed the meal. Bread sometimes appeared as well, proving that a table could contain more than one starch without anyone filing a formal complaint. The casserole was especially useful because it felt substantial. A pot of plain noodles might suggest that something was missing. A browned baking dish suggested that dinner had been made on purpose. Both meals survived because they offered more than low cost. Salmon patties gave canned fish a crisp exterior, clear portions, and the dignity of a main course. Baked macaroni and cheese turned inexpensive pasta into a warm centerpiece associated with comfort, family preference, and the browned corner everyone quietly wanted. Neither dish appeared in every American home, and neither followed one universal recipe. Yet both demonstrated a central skill of economical cooking. Appearance and texture could make modest ingredients feel complete. The skillet gave one can of salmon 6 chances to look generous. The casserole dish allowed milk, macaroni and cheese to fill nearly every plate. When the supper dishes were cleared, the next budget meal would reach for different pantry staples. Ground beef would meet cornmeal in one baking dish and tomatoes and rice in one skillet, producing 2 dinners whose names promised distant places while their real purpose remained firmly inside the family kitchen. A yellow bowl of cornmeal sat beside a skillet of browned ground beef, while a second pan held rice, tomatoes, onions, and enough liquid to carry the meal across several plates. Tamale pie and the dish many 1960s families called Spanish rice were not identical, and neither represented the full traditions suggested by its name. They were practical American home kitchen meals built around inexpensive starches, modest amounts of meat, canned tomatoes, and seasoning strong enough to make the whole dish feel generous. Cornmeal formed a warm topping or base. Rice absorbed sauce and multiplied quietly as it cooked. Ground beef supplied savoury flavour without needing to appear as a separate portion. Both meals were colourful, filling, and easy to serve from one pan. They also belonged to an era when magazine recipes, community cookbooks, food company booklets, and handwritten cards often adapted regional or international ideas into simplified casseroles designed for the family oven. The names sounded adventurous. The grocery list remained reassuringly ordinary. Tamale pie usually began with ground beef crumbling in a skillet beside chopped onion. Tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, or tomato paste gave the filling its deep red colour. Beans, corn, green pepper, olives, or mild chili seasoning might be added according to household taste, although many versions stayed simple enough for children who regarded visible peppers as a personal challenge. The mixture was poured into a casserole dish, or left in an oven-safe skillet. Then came the cornmeal layer. Some cooks prepared a soft cornmeal mush on the stove and spread it over the filling like a blanket. Others used a cornbread-style batter that baked into a lighter crust. A few placed the cornmeal beneath the meat or around the edges instead of on top. The finished dish was an American casserole interpretation rather than a tray of traditional tamales, but its purpose was clear. Cornmeal provided weight-absorbed sauce and allowed a small amount of seasoned beef to flavor an entire serving. Once the top turned golden and the filling bubbled at the edges, the pan looked far more substantial than the original package of hamburger. The first spoonful revealed why the dish worked. The cornmeal topping broke apart and mixed with the tomato-rich filling, so each bite carried meat sauce and starch together. No one received an obviously smaller piece of beef. The meat had been scattered too thoroughly for that. A cook could add another can of beans, a little more corn, or a thicker layer of topping when the table included extra people. Cheese might be sprinkled over the surface if the budget allowed, though the dish did not depend on it. Sour cream was not a standard companion in every household, and many families served tamale pie with nothing more than a green vegetable, a simple salad, or canned fruit. The casserole also tolerated reheating. By the following day, the cornmeal had absorbed more of the sauce, and the portions could sometimes be cut more cleanly than when fresh. It was the kind of meal that changed texture overnight, but did not lose its usefulness. Leftovers were not a failure of planning. They were evidence that the pan had done more than one evening's work. The name tamale pie could make the meal sound more elaborate than it was, and old home recipes often carried that cheerful confidence. A few familiar spices, a can of tomatoes, and cornmeal were enough to suggest flavors beyond the usual meat and potatoes plate. Yet families adapted the recipe to what they knew and what children would accept. Some versions were barely spicy. Others used chili powder generously. One household added black olives because a recipe card required them, while another removed them after a memorable dinner table dispute. The flexibility made the meal affordable, but it also meant that no single version can represent every kitchen. Mexican-American families and families with close knowledge of traditional tamales might have regarded the casserole as something entirely different from the food named on the card. Still within many mainstream American cookbooks, tamale pie became a convenient way to turn ground beef and cornmeal into a one-dish supper. It borrowed a name, simplified an idea, and then behaved exactly like the casseroles around it. Across the stove, rice was performing the same budget trick with even less ceremony. The dish, widely called Spanish rice in many American households, usually combined white rice, tomatoes, onion, and seasoning, sometimes with bell pepper, celery, bacon sausage, or ground beef. It was not one fixed Spanish recipe, nor did the name capture the many rice traditions of Spain, Mexico, Latin America, or the American Southwest. In the 1960s family kitchen, the term often referred to a tomato-coloured rice dish prepared in a skillet or saucepan. When ground beef was added, it became a complete supper rather than a side. The cook browned the meat and onions stirred in rice, and tomatoes added water or broth, then covered the pan and waited. The rice slowly absorbed the liquid, growing larger while carrying the tomato and beef flavour into every grain. Opening the lid too often was discouraged, though someone usually found a reason to look. Rice inspired faith in patience and occasional scraping from the bottom of the pan. Spanish rice with ground beef could expand almost without announcing the expansion. Another half cup of rice and a little more liquid added several servings at very little cost. Tomatoes provided colour and moisture, while onions and pepper created the smell of a meal that had been cooking longer than it sometimes had. If the family preferred a softer dish, more sauce went in. If they liked separate grains, the cook watched the liquid carefully and removed the pan from the heat before the bottom became a permanent part of the skillet. Some versions were spooned into bowls, others arrived in loose mounds beside green beans or corn. Tortillas might accompany the meal in some homes, while sliced white bread appeared in others. The combination was forgiving enough for leftovers and substitutions. A little cooked rice from the refrigerator could be revived with tomato sauce and beef. A small amount of hamburger left from another recipe could disappear into a much larger pan. Once again, the expensive ingredient became flavor rather than portion. Tamale pie and Spanish rice showed how the 1960s budget kitchen used starch not merely to fill empty space, but to organize the entire dinner. Cornmeal created a crust, a topping, and a visual centerpiece. Rice absorbed liquid seasoning and the smallest pieces of beef until the skillet seemed full. Both dishes brought color to the table through tomatoes, corn peppers, or browned topping, which helped them feel less austere than their grocery cost might suggest. They also reflected the era's habit of translating many food traditions into simplified family recipes, sometimes with names broader and less precise than the dishes deserved. What remained constant was the household need underneath the recipe. Dinner had to be warm, it had to stretch, it had to survive individual preferences and still leave enough for everyone. In the next casserole dish, chicken pieces would rest over a bed of rice, allowing broth drippings, and oven heat to turn a few modest portions into another full family supper. A shallow casserole dish waited beside a paper-wrapped package of chicken pieces, a measuring cup of rice, and enough broth to turn both into dinner. In many 1960s kitchens, chicken and rice bake offered a useful compromise between the dignity of serving real pieces of poultry and the economy of letting starch carry most of the meal. A whole chicken might be cut into legs, thighs, wings, and breast portions at home, or less expensive pieces could be purchased according to the week's grocery special. The chicken rested on top where everyone could see it. Beneath it, the rice absorbed broth drippings, onion and seasoning, until each spoonful tasted richer than its ingredient list suggested. This arrangement mattered. The meat still looked like the center of supper, but the rice occupied most of the casserole dish and most of the plate. 4 or 5 pieces of chicken could oversee a remarkable amount of food when placed above enough rice. The oven did the slow work, the glass dish did the presenting, and the family saw a complete meal rather than a calculation. The preparation often began with rice spread evenly across a greased baking dish. Chopped onion, celery, or green pepper might be scattered through it, depending on what the refrigerator held and what the family would tolerate. Liquid followed, sometimes plain broth, sometimes water, enriched with bouillon, and in many kitchens a mixture involving condensed soup and milk. Cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, or another canned soup could become both seasoning and sauce, helping the rice cook into a soft, savory layer beneath the meat. The exact formula varied widely, and handwritten recipes were not always precise. One card might say 1 can of soup without explaining the size. Another might instruct the cook to add enough water, a phrase that assumed years of experience or considerable optimism. The chicken pieces were seasoned, arranged, skin side up, and pressed lightly into the rice. By then the dish looked simple enough. The difficult part was making sure the rice had enough liquid to soften, without leaving the casserole watery, while the chicken cooked through without drying out. Convenience still required judgment. Once the dish entered the oven, the kitchen changed gradually. The sharp smell of raw onion softened into something sweet and savory. Chicken fat melted through the rice, and steam gathered beneath the oven door before escaping into the room. The skin browned where it remained above the liquid, while the rice near the edges developed a slightly toasted crust. Those edge pieces often became the cook's private reward or the subject of quiet competition. Opening the oven too frequently slowed the process, yet it was difficult not to check. Rice could behave perfectly for 40 minutes, and then surprise everyone near the end. If the liquid disappeared too quickly, the centre remained firm. If too much had been added, the chicken seemed to float above a pale lake. Experienced cooks learned to read the casserole through the glass, watching for bubbling at the sides, and testing a few grains with a spoon. When everything worked, the rice emerged swollen, tender, and deeply flavoured by ingredients that had begun the evening looking almost too modest to matter. The chicken pieces created the appearance of individual portions, but serving still required diplomacy. Legs were popular with children because they had a handle and seemed manageable. Thighs offered more meat, but could inspire suspicion among diners who preferred white meat. Wings disappeared quickly sometimes before their small size had been properly considered. Breast pieces might be divided, especially in a large household, so that one section could serve more than one person. The rice made such division easier. A smaller piece of chicken did not look inadequate when surrounded by a generous mound of seasoned rice and accompanied by peas, green beans, carrots, or canned fruit. Gravy was usually unnecessary because the rice had already collected the drippings and sauce. Bread might still appear, not because the meal lacked starch, but because bread had become a familiar insurance policy. If a child finished the chicken first, rice remained. If an adult arrived late, the casserole stayed warm. If someone wanted seconds, another spoonful could be lifted from beneath the place where the chicken had rested. The dish also reflected changing supermarket habits. Packaged chicken parts made it easier to buy only what a family preferred or could afford, while canned soups, bouillon, and shelf-stable rice simplified the sauce and reduced the number of pans required. A cook could assemble the casserole before the busiest part of the evening, slide it into the oven, and turn attention toward laundry, homework, younger children, or setting the table. Yet the meal was not effortless. Chicken had to be handled carefully, vegetables chopped, liquid measured, and the timing watched. The casserole dish still needed scrubbing after the rice formed a stubborn brown line around the edges. The promise was not freedom from kitchen work. It was the ability to combine the work into one vessel and let heat manage several ingredients at once. Compared with frying chicken in batches or preparing separate pots of rice sauce and vegetables that felt modern, one dish could move from oven to table and then covered with foil into the refrigerator. Leftovers were useful but changed quickly. The rice continued absorbing moisture as it cooled, becoming firmer by the next day. Small pieces of chicken could be removed from the bones and stirred through what remained, eliminating the problem of unequal portions during the second meal. A little broth or milk restored softness during reheating. Peas, leftover vegetables, or another spoonful of condensed soup could turn the casserole into something closer to a creamy chicken and rice skillet. In households where nothing edible was discarded casually, even the smallest scraps around a wing or back piece were picked clean. The bones might flavour another broth, although not every family extended the meal that far. The casserole had already performed its main task. It allowed a few chicken pieces to season enough rice for an entire table, and sometimes enough for lunch the following day. The meat had not multiplied, but its flavour had travelled. For many families, chicken and rice bake occupied the comfortable middle ground between an old-fashioned chicken dinner and the convenience foods reshaping the decade. The chicken remained recognisable. The rice carried the flavour. The canned soup, when used, stayed mostly invisible, quietly holding the ingredients together. It was economical without appearing empty and practical, without arriving fully prepared from a box. Families remember the browned skin, the soft rice beneath it, the spoons scraping along the glass dish, and the question of who would receive the final piece of chicken. Beneath those memories was the same skill found in meatloaf, gravy, and dumplings. The most expensive ingredient did not need to fill the plate if it could flavour everything around it. In the next kitchen, tougher beef would be given even more time. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and a low simmer were waiting to turn one modest cut into a pot of stew, and then stretch a weekend roast beyond its first appearance at the table. A heavy pot sat over low heat with cubes of beef, quartered potatoes, thick carrot rounds, and onions slowly disappearing into the steam. In many 1960s kitchens, beef stew began with a cut of meat that would have been disappointing if cooked quickly. The pieces could be firm, streaked with connective tissue, and far less tender than the steaks pictured in supermarket advertisements. Time changed their value. Browning gave the beef a dark crust. Water or broth loosened the flavourful bits from the bottom of the pot, and several quiet hours turned toughness into richness. The vegetables did most of the work of filling the bowls. Potatoes absorbed the gravy. Carrots added sweetness and colour. Onions softened until they were almost part of the sauce. The beef remained important, but it no longer had to occupy most of the serving. A few cubes in each bowl were enough when surrounded by thick broth and vegetables. The large pot made waiting worthwhile, and it made a modest package of beef look capable of feeding everyone. The first stage often filled the kitchen with more noise than the long simmer that followed. Beef cubes were patted dry, dusted with flour, or seasoned directly before being lowered into hot fat. The pieces had to be browned in batches if the cook wanted colour rather than a grey layer of steam, though busy evenings did not always allow such careful procedure. Onion might enter after the meat, followed by water broth tomato juice, or a small amount of canned tomato. Bay leaf pepper salt, or a splash of Worcestershire sauce supplied depth without requiring an expensive list of seasonings. Then the lid went on, the heat went down, and the meal began its slow transformation. A pressure cooker shortened the process in some households, releasing an occasional hiss that made children curious and adults cautious. Other families trusted a Dutch oven, an enamel pot, or a covered casserole dish. The equipment varied, but the principle remained the same. Tougher beef was not poor beef if the kitchen gave it enough moisture and time. Potatoes and carrots usually entered later, so they would soften without completely surrendering their shape. Their size was a household decision. Large pieces made the stew appear rustic and substantial. Smaller pieces distributed more evenly, ensuring that every bowl contained several. Celery, peas, turnips, or other vegetables might be added according to region season, and what remained in the refrigerator. Flour from the browned beef thickened the liquid, or a separate mixture of flour and water was stirred in near the end. The cook watched closely during this step. Gravy that was too thin made the dish feel like soup, while gravy that was too thick could settle heavily around the spoon. A good stew clung to the vegetables without becoming paste. Bread, biscuits, or crackers often waited nearby to collect the final sauce. When the ladle struck the bottom of the pot, it brought up meat, potato, carrot, and onion together. The serving looked generous because the ingredients had stopped competing for attention and become one meal. Beef stew also rewarded planning beyond the first dinner. The flavours settled overnight, and many families considered the second serving better than the first. The gravy thickened in the refrigerator and loosened again over low heat. Additional potatoes, peas, or broth could be added if the remaining amount needed to stretch farther. A small bowl might become a larger pot with very little explanation. The stew travelled well in a thermos for a work lunch and reheated without losing its character. Unlike a carefully sliced roast, it did not reveal exactly how much meat remained. The beef had already been divided into small pieces and distributed through the vegetables. This made leftovers easier to manage and portions easier to adjust. A child who disliked carrots could search around them. An adult could receive more broth and potatoes without feeling that dinner had become smaller. The dish was economical not only because it used a less tender cut, but because every part of it could be served, saved, expanded, and served again. Pot roast used a larger piece of beef but followed the same belief in patient heat. A chuck roast or another braising cut was browned, placed in a covered pot, and surrounded by onions, potatoes, and carrots. Water broth tomato or pan juices created the moist environment that allowed the roast to soften over several hours. The smell arrived long before dinner, drifting through the house, and making the meal seem more luxurious than the grocery arithmetic behind it. Pot roast was often associated with Sunday or a weekend afternoon because it needed time, yet it did not require constant movement once the lid was in place. Someone still had to prepare the vegetables, watch the liquid, and judge when the meat was tender, but the oven or stovetop carried much of the long middle portion. The roast could look impressive when placed on a platter, even if the real abundance came from the vegetables arranged around it. Slicing the roast required another form of quiet calculation. The knife moved across the grain, producing thin pieces that could be distributed more widely than thick slices. Gravy covered the meat and potatoes, helping each portion feel complete. Carrots and onions filled the open spaces on the plate. If the roast was tender enough, it might break apart instead of slicing neatly, but that rarely reduced its appeal. The most flavorful pieces were often those that had rested closest to the bottom of the pot where the juices collected. Children might ask for the least fatty slice. Adults sometimes preferred the edges or the softer sections threaded with connective tissue that had finally melted. The meal felt substantial because a recognizable roast still occupied the center of the table, yet the cook knew that its real value would be measured not only by the first serving, but by what remained after the platter returned to the kitchen. A successful pot roast could produce several later meals. Cold slices became sandwiches with mustard or mayonnaise. Chopped beef and potatoes went into hash. Small scraps entered soup gravy or a casserole. The remaining cooking liquid could be saved because it contained the flavor of the meat, vegetables, and browned pan. Even the least attractive pieces gained usefulness once chopped finely. This was where pot roast separated itself from a dinner designed for only one evening. The first meal offered the ceremony of a large piece of beef. The next meals offered economy. Families who planned carefully understood both parts before the roast entered the oven. Sunday's platter might quietly become Monday's sandwiches, and Tuesday's skillet allowing one purchase to serve the household repeatedly without returning in exactly the same form. Beef stew and pot roast turned waiting into an ingredient. They relied on cuts that needed patience, vegetables that could absorb flavor, and cooks who understood that tenderness was created rather than purchased. Neither dish was inexpensive for every family, and the amount of beef varied according to income, region, and the week's store specials. Yet both showed how a large pot could make a limited amount of meat feel abundant. Stew scattered the beef through bowls filled with potatoes and gravy. Pot roast presented it proudly, then asked the leftovers to keep working for several more days. As the last spoonful of broth was saved, and the remaining roast was wrapped for tomorrow, another economical object waited in the kitchen, a ham bone with almost no meat left on it, still capable of flavoring a pot of beans and beginning an entirely new dinner. A ham bone resting on a plate could look finished, but in many 1960s kitchens it was only between assignments. A few ragged pieces of meat still clung to it, and the bone itself carried salt smoke and enough flavor to season another meal. Into a deep pot it went with dried beans, onion water, and perhaps celery, carrot, or bay leaf. What had been the center of Sunday dinner became the quiet foundation of ham and bean soup. The transformation depended on patience more than expense. Beans swelled slowly, the broth turned cloudy and rich, and small pieces of ham loosened from the bone and spread through the pot. By supper, no one was looking at leftovers. They were looking at full bowls thick with beans and carrying the flavor of a meal that had supposedly ended a day or two earlier. The work began before the soup reached the stove. Dried beans were poured onto the table or into a shallow pan and examined by hand. Small stones, broken pieces and beans that looked too old or damaged were removed. The rest were rinsed and often soaked, though the method varied from one household to another. Navy beans, Great Northern beans, Limas pintos and other varieties could all appear depending on region and family habit. The ham bone went into the pot with water and seasoning, sometimes accompanied by the pan juices saved from the original meal. Onion was almost unavoidable. Carrot or celery added sweetness. Some cooks included tomato, while others preferred a pale broth thickened only by the beans themselves. The pot simmered until the beans softened and the meat surrendered from the bone. Then the bone was lifted out, cooled briefly, and inspected one more time. Any usable scrap was pulled free and returned to the soup. A household that saved a ham bone was not likely to waste what still remained attached to it. Ham and bean soup stretched because its strongest flavour came from the ingredient with the least visible meat. A bone, a rind, or several small trimmings could season many bowls. The bean supplied most of the substance, while bread, cornbread, or crackers finished the work. If the soup was thin, it could be served over bread or accompanied by a larger slice. If it was thick, it might sit heavily on the spoon and require only a little buttered toast. The texture often changed during cooking as some beans broke apart and softened the broth. An experienced cook might mash a few against the side of the pot to make the soup seem richer. No cream was required. The beans created their own body. The result tasted as though the ham were more plentiful than it truly was because salt and smoke travelled through every spoonful. The bone had no impressive portion left to offer, so it offered flavour instead. The soup improved its usefulness by refusing to remain the same from one day to the next. On the first evening, the broth might be loose and the beans clearly separate. After a night in the refrigerator, everything became thicker. Reheated with a little water, the pot could feed the family again. More beans, vegetables, or broth could be added if necessary. A leftover spoonful of mashed potatoes might disappear into the soup as a thickener. Small pieces of ham saved from another plate could join the pot without changing its identity. The meal tolerated these additions because it had never depended on strict measurements. It depended on judgment memory and the willingness to let yesterday's food continue working. By the second or third serving, the ham bone was gone, but its influence remained in every bowl. Farther south, and especially in Louisiana, kitchens, red beans and rice used a related economy, but carried its own history, seasoning and regional identity. The dish was not simply beans placed beside rice. It grew from local cooking traditions shaped by Creole, African American, Caribbean, European and Gulf Coast influences, and family versions could differ sharply. Red kidney beans or small red beans, simmered with onion, celery, bell pepper, garlic, herbs and spices. Smoked sausage ham, salt pork or a leftover bone might provide flavour, but the beans and rice supplied the volume. In some households, Monday became associated with red beans because the pot could cook slowly, while other household work was done, though the strength of that tradition varied by family and place. The meal carried regional meaning as well as thrift. It belonged to particular communities before it became a broader image of economical southern cooking. The beans cooked until creamy, sometimes with a portion mashed against the pot to thicken the liquid. Rice was prepared separately, each grain expected to remain distinct enough to hold the sauce. At serving time, the proportions could be adjusted according to appetite and supply. A large amount of rice stretched a smaller ladle of beans. More beans made the plate richer when the pot was full. Sausage or ham pieces were distributed through the mixture rather than handed out as separate servings, allowing a modest amount of meat to season the entire meal. Hot sauce, green onion, or additional seasoning might appear at the table, but the basic satisfaction came from the contrast between fluffy rice and creamy beans. The smell was deeper than that of plain bean soup, carrying pepper, smoke, onion, and long cooking. A pot could feed a family generously and still leave enough for the next day when the flavors often seemed even more settled. Red beans and rice demonstrated how misleading the word cheap can be when applied to traditional food. The ingredients could be economical, but the meal was not without craft memory or cultural weight. Seasoning developed over time. Texture had to be watched. Families argued gently or seriously about which sausage belonged in the pot, whether the beans should be very creamy and how much rice was proper. A simplified version in a mainstream cookbook might reduce the dish to beans, tomato, and rice, but that did not capture the full tradition behind it. For some families, this was ordinary weekday food. For others, it was a taste tied to place relatives and community. Its ability to stretch meat was only one reason it endured. The flavor was another. A dinner can be practical without feeling temporary, and red beans and rice proved that economy and identity could occupy the same plate. Ham and bean soup and red beans and rice both began with the belief that a small piece of pork could flavor far more food than it could fill by itself. One pot leaned on the memory of a previous ham dinner. The other belonged to a strong regional tradition with its own rhythms and expectations. Both relied on beans' time and the cook's ability to judge when the broth had become rich enough. Neither meal required meat in every bite because smoke, salt, onion, and seasoning had already travelled through the entire pot. By the time the bowls were cleared, a bone that appeared useless had completed another dinner and perhaps a third. The next economical supper would be even quieter. A paper sack of potatoes, a loaf of bread, and a saucepan of milk or broth were waiting to show how a family meal could feel complete with almost no meat at all. A paper sack of potatoes leaned against the cabinet while an onion, a saucepan, and a loaf of sliced bread waited on the counter. There was no roast thawing in the refrigerator, no package of ground beef, and no chicken browning in the oven. Yet dinner was still possible. Potato soup was one of the quietest economical meals in the 1960s kitchen because it did not try to imitate a meat dinner or hide its simplicity beneath an elaborate name. It depended on potatoes' liquid seasoning and the cook's ability to make a thin list of ingredients feel warm and sufficient. In one household, the soup was pale and creamy with milk. In another, it was built from broth or water and thickened by potatoes breaking apart in the pot. A little bacon, ham, or drippings might add flavour, but many versions use little meat or none at all. Bread completed the meal, absorbing broth, carrying butter, and giving anyone who remained hungry one more dependable slice. The potatoes had to be peeled unless the family preferred pieces of skin left behind, then cut into cubes that would soften at roughly the same time. Peeling several pounds produced a growing pile of thin brown strips and left the cook's hands damp with starch. The pieces went into cold water to keep them from darkening while onion was chopped and perhaps celery or carrot prepared. Some cooks began by softening onion in butter, margarine, bacon, grease, or another cooking fat. Others placed everything directly into the pot and trusted the simmer to bring the flavours together. Water broth or milk covered the vegetables and the saucepan slowly began to steam. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no sharp sizzle after the first few minutes and no browned crust forming beneath an oven light. Potato soup announced itself gradually through the smell of onion and warm starch, the soft tapping of a spoon against the pot, and the kitchen window becoming faintly clouded. Texture separated one family's soup from another. Some cooks wanted distinct potato cubes floating in a thin broth. Others mashed part of the pot with a fork or potato masher, allowing the broken pieces to thicken the liquid naturally. A flour and milk mixture could be stirred in for a smoother, heavier version, although it had to be added carefully to avoid lumps. Evaporated milk sometimes supplied richness when fresh milk was limited or reserved for breakfast and children. In still other kitchens, the soup remained almost rustic, with potatoes, onion, pepper, and enough cooking liquid to fill the bowl. The recipe adjusted itself to the pantry. If there was celery, it went in. If a small piece of ham remained, it was diced finely, so its flavour appeared in more spoonfuls. If the soup looked too thin, another potato could be grated or mashed into it. If it became too thick, a little water restored movement. The meal required no rare ingredient, but it rewarded the person who understood how potatoes behaved. Seasoning mattered because there was nowhere for poor seasoning to hide. Salt brought the potatoes forward, while black pepper supplied warmth and visible contrast against the pale broth. Onion carried much of the flavour. A bay leaf, parsley, celery leaves, or a little garlic might appear depending on regional habit and family preference. Bacon drippings could make the soup taste as though it contained more bacon than it did. A ham bone or several scraps from an earlier meal could perform the same service, though potato soup did not need them to justify its place at the table. Some families added cheese near the end, but a heavily loaded bowl was not the only version remembered from the decade. For many households, the soup was valued precisely because it remained plain. It was what appeared when grocery day was still distant, the weather was cold, or someone wanted dinner without another expensive purchase. The potatoes did not create excitement, they created relief. Bread made that relief more complete. Sliced white bread might be served directly from the wrapper stacked on a plate, or warmed briefly in the oven. Butter or margarine softened against the surface. Toast offered a firmer companion, especially when dipped into the soup one corner at a time. Crackers could be crushed over the bowl, but bread had the advantage of becoming another serving without requiring another pot. Children sometimes tore slices into pieces and dropped them directly into the broth, watching them swell, until the spoon could barely identify where bread ended and soup began. Adults used a final piece to wipe the bowl nearly clean. In households where homemade bread or biscuits were common, those might appear instead carrying their own labour and family traditions. Whatever its form, the bread was not decorative. It was part of the dinner's structure. A bowl of soup could feel temporary. A bowl of soup with 2 slices of bread felt planned. The meal's economy came from ingredients that were inexpensive filling and easy to store, but the word cheap still failed to describe the work behind them. Someone had remembered to buy the potatoes before the sack was empty. Someone peeled and chopped them, watched the pot, adjusted the liquid, and decided whether the soup needed another pinch of salt. Someone rationed the milk between dinner, breakfast, and school lunches. Someone noticed that the last heel of bread should be used tonight before it became too dry. Potato soup did not require the long attention of chicken and dumplings, or the careful browning of a pot roast, but it still depended on household judgment. Too much heat could scorch milk against the bottom of the saucepan. Too little seasoning left the entire meal flat. Potatoes cooked too long vanished into paste, while undercooked cubes resisted the spoon. Simplicity did not remove skill. It made skill easier to notice. Leftovers usually thickened in the refrigerator until the soup resembled a soft potato mixture rather than liquid. Reheating required patience and another splash of milk broth or water. The second serving might include a new handful of vegetables, a little grated cheese, or several pieces of leftover ham. A small amount could become lunch for one person, while a larger pot could return as dinner with fresh bread beside it. The soup rarely became more beautiful overnight, but beauty had never been its strongest argument. Its value was reliability. Potatoes waited in the sack. Onions waited nearby. Bread filled the space between hunger and enough. When other ingredients were scarce, these ordinary foods could still create steam above a bowl and silence around a table. For many families, potato soup is remembered through that silent spoons moving slowly, bread dipping into pale broth, and the refrigerator humming in the background. It was not the meal served to display prosperity or impress visitors. It was the meal that appeared when the household needed dinner to be gentle with the budget and generous with portions. Some versions were creamy, some brothy, some smoky with bacon, and some almost entirely potatoes and onion. The common achievement was that nearly no meat could still produce a complete evening meal. From this plain pot the next dinners would become more carefully shaped. Cabbage leaves and bell peppers were waiting to be filled with rice and ground meat, turning inexpensive vegetables into individual packages that made a modest filling look plentiful again. A head of cabbage and several green bell peppers could do something a pile of loose ingredients could not. They could divide dinner before it ever reached the table. In many 1960s kitchens, cabbage rolls and stuffed peppers turned rice, ground meat, onions and tomato sauce into tidy individual portions, each vegetable becoming its own edible serving dish. The filling was economical because rice occupied much of the space while a smaller amount of beef or pork supplied flavour. The vegetables gave the meal height colour and the appearance of careful preparation. A casserole of loose meat and rice might look like something assembled quickly. The same mixture wrapped in a cabbage leaf or packed inside a hollow pepper looked deliberate. It also made portioning easier. One roll or one pepper could be placed on each plate with extra sauce spooned over the top and bread or potatoes added around it. The food had not become more expensive. It had simply been arranged to look complete. Cabbage rolls began with the difficult task of persuading a firm head of cabbage to become flexible. The outer leaves were removed and the whole head might be lowered into boiling water, while individual leaves were loosened one at a time. Steam rose around the pot and the kitchen filled with the unmistakable smell of cooking cabbage. The thick centre rib of each leaf was trimmed or flattened so the leaf could bend without tearing. This was not quick work, especially when enough rolls were needed for a large family. The filling waited nearby in a mixing bowl, ground beef, pork or a combination, along with rice, onion, salt, pepper and sometimes egg. Some recipes used cooked rice, while others relied on partially cooked or uncooked rice that would absorb liquid during baking. The exact method came from family tradition, community cookbooks, immigrant kitchens, church suppers, and handwritten cards whose instructions often assume the cook already knew the most important parts. The filled leaf was folded like a small package. The sides came inward, the bottom rolled upward, and the seam was placed beneath the roll so it would remain closed. Several dozen could fit tightly inside a roasting pan or deep casserole dish, their pale green surfaces lined up in rows. Tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, broth, or a sweet and sour mixture was poured around them depending on the household. Eastern European, Jewish, German, Polish, Ukrainian, Slovak, Balkan, and other family traditions shaped versions across the country, while regional American adaptations changed the seasoning and sauce. Some rolls were strongly savoury, others balanced tomato with brown sugar vinegar, raisins, or lemon. It would be misleading to treat all cabbage rolls as one universal 1960s recipe. What united many versions was the use of cabbage and rice to extend a modest amount of meat. The dish carried cultural memory, but it also answered a practical question that crossed many communities. How could one package of ground meat produce enough recognizable portions for everyone? As the rolls baked, the cabbage softened around the filling and absorbed the sauce. The smell became sweeter and less sharp than it had been during boiling. When the pan reached the table, the rolls were tender enough to cut with a fork, though the outer leaf sometimes resisted just long enough to remind a child that dinner contained a vegetable. Mashed potatoes, boiled potatoes, rye bread or simple white bread often helped collect the sauce. One roll might satisfy a younger child, while adults received two if the pan allowed it. Leftovers were particularly useful because cabbage rolls reheated well, and often tasted richer after resting overnight. The rice continued to absorb the sauce, and the flavours of meat, cabbage, onion, and tomato settled together. A large batch required considerable preparation, but it could feed the household more than once. Economy did not always mean making dinner quickly. Sometimes it meant investing labour on one day so the same pan could return for several meals. Bell peppers offered a brighter and more upright version of the same strategy. Their tops were sliced away, the seeds and pale inner ribs removed, and the hollow shells arranged in a baking dish like small green cups. Red and yellow peppers existed, but green bell peppers were common, affordable and sturdy enough to hold a heavy filling. The mixture often included ground beef, cooked rice, onion, tomato sauce and seasoning. Some cooks added corn, celery, Worcestershire sauce cheese, or leftover vegetables. Others used nearly the same filling they prepared for meatloaf, adjusting it with rice and tomatoes. The peppers could be filled to the top, capped with their trimmed lids, or left open beneath a layer of sauce. A small quantity of meat became 4, 6, or 8 clear servings. The vegetable itself supplied volume, although not every child considered that an advantage. The smell of baked green pepper was strong enough to announce the menu from another room, and no amount of tomato sauce could make the pepper entirely anonymous. Stuffed peppers made the table look generous because every person received a whole object rather than a spoonful from a shared casserole. The cook could also adjust the size of the servings naturally. Large peppers went to adults or older children, while smaller ones served younger diners. If the filling ran short, more rice or tomato could be added. If a pepper tore, it was placed against the side of the dish where the others could support it. The sauce collected at the bottom, mixing with juices from the meat and vegetables. During serving, a wide spoon or spatula was needed to lift each pepper without collapsing it. On the plate, the shell softened beneath the fork and released the filling in a mound. Some diners ate every part. Others removed the rice and meat with careful precision and left behind a remarkably clean green container. Household economy could place the vegetable on the plate, but it could not always guarantee cooperation. Both cabbage rolls and stuffed peppers were meals of visible order. The expensive ingredient was hidden inside, but the portions were clearly defined before anyone sat down. Rice stretched the meat-vegetable supplied structure, and tomato sauce connected everything. These dishes also revealed how budget cooking could preserve family and immigrant traditions rather than erase them. A cabbage roll might carry a grandparent's method across languages and regions. A stuffed pepper might come from a magazine recipe, a neighbour, or a community cookbook, and then change gradually to suit one family's preferences. Neither dinner belonged to every American household, but for those who remember them, the image's specific rows of cabbage rolls beneath red sauce or green peppers standing in a glass baking dish under the oven light. The labour behind those neat portions was easy to overlook. Someone softened the leaves, trimmed the peppers, cooked the rice, mixed. The filling wiped sauce from the counter and judged whether the pan held enough. The final result looked contained and orderly, because the disorder had already been handled in the kitchen. That was part of the appeal. Modest ingredients arrived at the table as individual packages, each one suggesting that dinner had been made especially for the person receiving it. In the next meal, ground beef would be shaped again, but the vegetables would disappear from the outside. Rice would push through simmering meatballs like tiny white quills, while onion gravy would help hamburger patties borrow the appearance of steak. A mixing bowl of ground beef sat beside a small measuring cup of rice, while another portion waited to be flattened into oval patties beneath a sheet of wax paper. Porcupine meatballs and Salisbury steak gave economical hamburger two very different disguises in the 1960s kitchen. One turned rice into tiny white points that pushed through the surface as the meatballs simmered. The other shaped ground beef into individual portions, covered them with onion gravy, and borrowed some of the ceremony of steak without requiring an expensive cut. Both dinners understood that shape could influence how a meal felt. Loose hamburger in a skillet looked like an ingredient. Round meatballs or neat oval patties looked like a main course. A parent could place 1 or 2 portions on each plate, add potatoes, rice, bread, or vegetables, and make the distribution appear orderly. The ground beef had not become more plentiful. It had simply put on more respectable clothes. Porcupine meatballs usually began with uncooked rice mixed directly into the beef. Onion, salt, pepper, and perhaps an egg or a small amount of seasoning completed the mixture. The cook formed it into balls and placed them in a deep skillet, saucepan, or casserole dish. Tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, tomato soup, or another seasoned liquid was poured around them before the pan was covered. As the meatballs simmered, the rice absorbed moisture and expanded. Individual grains pushed outward through the surface, producing the bristled appearance that gave the dish its memorable name. The effect could delight children before they had tasted a bite. A meatball resembling a tiny porcupine was more interesting than an ordinary ball of hamburger, even though no one was expected to examine the resemblance too closely. The rice also performed serious household work. It stretched the beef, softened the texture, and helped one package of meat produce more individual servings than plain meatballs of the same size. The sauce was essential because the rice needed enough liquid to cook without leaving the meatballs dry. A covered pan trapped steam, allowing the grains inside the beef to soften, while the tomato mixture thickened around them. The cook had to resist disturbing the meatballs too early. A spoon pushed too firmly against the side could break one apart and release a small landslide of rice into the sauce. When the timing worked, the finished meatballs remained intact but tender, each one carrying meat starch and seasoning in a single portion. Mashed potatoes might appear beside them, creating a plate with 2 different starches and no need for apology. Other families used extra rice noodles, green beans, corn, or bread to complete the meal. The tomato sauce could be spooned over everything, making a small number of meatballs feel connected to a much larger dinner. A child might count the visible grains or choose the meatball with the most impressive quills. The cook was more likely to count how many remained in the pan. The name made porcupine meatballs memorable, but their real appeal was flexibility. A large family could receive smaller meatballs, while a household with fewer diners might make them larger and save the rest for tomorrow. More rice extended the mixture, although too much could cause the meatballs to lose their structure. The recipe therefore depended on judgment rather than unlimited stretching. Leftovers reheated well because the tomato sauce protected the meat from drying out. By the following day, the rice had absorbed even more flavor, and the sauce had become thicker. The dish could be served from the refrigerator to a saucepan without needing to become something new. That was useful on evenings when a second meal mattered more than variety. Porcupine meatballs were playful enough for children, practical enough for the budget, and tidy enough to look planned. They turned a meat extender into the dish's most recognizable feature, instead of trying to hide it. Salisbury steak used a different strategy. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, onion, egg, milk, or seasonings, then shaped into flat oval patties. The shape mattered because it separated the dish from hamburgers. These patties were not headed toward buns. They were browned in a skillet and finished beneath gravy, often with onions or mushrooms, until they resembled small individual steaks. Homemade versions varied considerably, and frozen television dinners later gave many people another image of Salisbury steak complete with carefully separated vegetables and mashed potatoes. In the family kitchen, however, the meal was usually less uniform. Patties differed slightly in size because they had been shaped by hand. Onion rings softened unevenly in the gravy. The pan carried the browned bits from the meat, and the sauce gained flavor as a spoon scraped them loose, What began as hamburger acquired the appearance of a more formal supper through browning shaping and a generous covering of gravy. The gravy allowed the patties to stretch beyond their physical size. Flour thickened the pan drippings while broth water milk canned soup or another convenient base supplied volume. Sliced onions cooked until soft and sweet, spreading their flavour through the sauce. Mushrooms appeared in some versions, though not in every household, and not always with the approval of younger diners. Once the patties returned to the skillet, they simmered until cooked through and coated in gravy. Mashed potatoes were the natural companion because they provided a second surface for the sauce. Noodles, rice, or bread could serve the same purpose. A modest patty looked more substantial when surrounded by potatoes and covered from edge to edge. The gravy also softened any dryness caused by stretching the meat with crumbs. Once again, the least expensive ingredients carried much of the meal, while the beef supplied the identity. At the table, Salisbury steak offered the reassuring appearance of equal portions. Each person received one patty, and the cook could divide any extras only after the first round had been served. Younger children might receive a smaller piece cut from a larger patty, though the gravy helped conceal the adjustment. Peas, green beans, carrots, or canned corn added colour, while bread collected whatever sauce remained. The dish felt more formal than sloppy joes and more individual than goulash. It could be eaten with a knife and fork. It occupied its own place on the plate. The name contained the word steak, and the gravy encouraged everyone to accept the suggestion. No one was likely to mistake the texture for a restaurant steak, but that was not necessary. The meal offered a familiar flavour in a shape associated with something more expensive, and sometimes appearance provided exactly the lift an ordinary weeknight needed. Porcupine meatballs and Salisbury steak showed two ways economical cooks made ground beef feel new. Rice became visible and playful, pushing through meatballs as proof that stretching could become part of the attraction. Breadcrumbs and gravy remained quieter, helping hamburger patties borrow the structure and presentation of steak. Neither dish depended on deception. Families knew what they were eating, and many remembered it fondly because the meals were warm-filling and shaped by someone's practiced hands. The achievement was not turning hamburger into luxury, it was turning it into enough. In the next kitchen ground, beef would step aside for tougher cuts and stronger opinions. Swiss steak would slowly soften beneath tomato gravy, while liver and onions would fill the house with the smell children could identify long before they reached the table. A round steak lay beneath a sheet of wax paper, while the flat side of a meat mallet struck it again and again, pressing flour and seasoning into a cut that needed more help than a quick trip through the skillet could provide. Nearby, a package of sliced liver waited beside a bowl of onions and a pan already warming with bacon, grease butter, or margarine. Swiss steak and liver with onions represented two very different answers to the 1960s family budget. Swiss steak used pounding flour, tomatoes and long cooking to soften a tougher cut of beef. Liver required only a short time in the pan, but it demanded considerably more persuasion at the table. Both meals offered recognizable portions of meat without the price of tender steak cuts. Both depended on onions, gravy potatoes, or bread to make the plate feel generous, and both produced aromas strong enough to tell children what was coming before anyone called them to dinner. Despite its name, Swiss steak did not come from Switzerland. The word referred to Swissing, a method of tenderizing meat by pounding or rolling it until the fibers began to break down. In a home kitchen, the process could be performed with a meat mallet, the edge of a heavy plate, or another solid utensil, trusted not to damage the counter. Round steak was cut into serving pieces, seasoned and often pressed into flour before browning. Each strike flattened the meat slightly and drove flour into the surface, helping it develop a crust and later thicken the cooking liquid. The sound travelled through the house in firm, regular blows. Children might appear in the doorway to investigate, only to learn that dinner still required several hours. Tenderizing the meat was only the beginning. Swiss steak succeeded slowly after the skillet had finished making noise and the covered pan had settled into a long, quiet simmer. Once browned, the meat was surrounded by onions, canned tomatoes, tomato sauce broth, or some combination chosen by the cook. Celery, bell pepper, carrots, or garlic might join the pan depending on the recipe and what remained in the refrigerator. Some versions were bright with tomato, while others leaned toward brown gravy with only a little tomato for acidity. The flour coating loosened into the liquid and helped create a sauce that clung to the beef. Moist heat worked gradually on the tough fibers, turning a stubborn slice into something that could be cut with the side of a fork when the timing went well. When it did not, the family received a useful reminder that patience and tenderness were related but not guaranteed. A round steak could simmer for a very long time while maintaining opinions of its own. Experienced cooks checked the liquid, turned the pieces, and allowed another half hour rather than serving meat that still resisted the knife. Swiss steak stretched across the plate through its gravy. Mashed potatoes, noodles, rice or bread collected the tomato-rich sauce, allowing a moderate portion of beef to flavour a much larger serving. One slice could be divided for a younger child, especially when potatoes occupied the centre of the plate and vegetables filled the remaining space. The onions softened until they nearly disappeared, while the tomatoes broke down into a sauce that made the meat look richer and more generous. Leftovers were useful because another night in the refrigerator often improved the texture and deepened the flavour. A small remaining piece could be chopped into gravy and spooned over potatoes, transforming one incomplete portion into lunch for more than one person. The dish rewarded slow cooking and careful reuse. It did not make a tough cut identical to a tender steak, but it gave that cut enough time, moisture and support to become a respectable family dinner. Liver and onions required almost the opposite approach. Liver cooked quickly, and too much time in the skillet could turn it dry, firm, and even more difficult for reluctant diners to appreciate. The slices were sometimes soaked in milk, dredged lightly in flour, and seasoned before frying. Onions were cooked until soft and browned, their sweetness intended to balance the stronger mineral flavour of the meat. Bacon might appear in the pan, contributing fat smoke and a useful distraction. The smell moved rapidly through the house. Unlike a casserole that revealed itself gradually, liver announced the menu with confidence. Children returning from the yard or finishing homework could identify it before reaching the kitchen. Some approached the table with enthusiasm. Others began considering whether a sudden loss of appetite might qualify as a medical event. Liver was economical, but it was rarely neutral. For adults who enjoyed it, the appeal was straightforward. Liver browned quickly paired well with onions and gravy, and could be served in individual slices like other meat entrees. Mashed potatoes were common beside it, because they softened the stronger flavour and provided a place for pan gravy. Green beans, peas, carrots, or canned corn added familiar colours to a plate dominated by brown and beige. For children who disliked it, every accompaniment became a possible hiding place. A small piece could be buried beneath potatoes, divided into increasingly tiny bites, or followed immediately by milk. Dinner table rules often determined how long this negotiation continued. Some children were expected to clean the plate. Others had to eat only a few bites. In certain households, no alternative meal was offered. The liver therefore carried more than flavour. It carried the memory of obedience, parental patience, stubborn refusal, and the long silence that could settle over a plate containing one final piece. The meal varied across families, regions, and generations. Some people remember calf's liver cooked tenderly with sweet onions and bacon, a dinner they would gladly eat again. Others remember thin slices cooked until grey, served with the solemn assurance that they were good for growing children. Nutritional beliefs influenced its place on many tables, but the memories should not be reduced to health claims. Liver was also used because it was practical, quick, and often less costly than the beef cuts families preferred. It provided a clear portion of meat without requiring a roast or a long oven schedule. Yet affordability did not guarantee popularity. A budget dinner still had to pass through the taste of the people eating it, and liver made that passage more difficult than most. No amount of onion could make every child forget what was underneath, though many parents gave the onions a determined opportunity. Swiss steak and liver with onions revealed two kinds of persuasion inside the economical kitchen. The first persuaded tough beef to soften through pounding moisture and thyme. The second persuaded the family to accept a strong-flavoured meat through onions, gravy potatoes, and firmly stated dinner rules. Neither meal appeared in every American home, and neither is entirely forgotten today. Their place at the weekly table has simply become less secure as tastes, meat prices, convenience foods, and family schedules have changed. Still, the memories remain unusually vivid, the mallet striking round steak beneath wax paper, tomato gravy bubbling around the edges of a covered pan, onions browning in the skillet, and a child studying one piece of liver as though negotiations might reopen. The next economical dinner would require much less persuasion from the stove. A cardboard box of frozen fish sticks was waiting in the freezer, ready to bring identical golden portions to the table beside macaroni and peas. A cardboard box covered with freezer frost slid across the kitchen counter, and inside it lay a row of fish sticks so uniform that no one needed to ask which piece was larger. In many 1960s homes, fish sticks promised an easier weeknight dinner at a moment when the frozen food aisle was becoming a more familiar part of supermarket shopping. The cook no longer had to clean a whole fish, remove bones, or stand beside a skillet turning delicate fillets. The breaded pieces went onto a metal baking sheet, entered the oven, and emerged with crisp golden surfaces that children could recognize immediately. Macaroni and peas completed the plate, supplying the starch, color, and volume that allowed one box to feed several people. The fish sticks were the visible main course, but the macaroni did most of the work of satisfying hunger. The peas made a brave attempt at respectability. Together the three formed a dinner that looked modern, portioned, and surprisingly orderly for something assembled from a freezer box, a saucepan, and a can or bag of vegetables. The freezer itself was often small by modern standards. In many refrigerators, the frozen compartment occupied a narrow space above the main shelves and collected frost thick enough to reduce its capacity further. A box of fish sticks had to compete with ice trays, frozen orange juice, concentrate packages of vegetables, and perhaps a few carefully wrapped leftovers. The carton might soften slightly before grocery bags were unpacked, then freeze again against the compartment wall. On the chosen evening, someone pulled it free, sometimes taking a small patch of frost along with it. The sticks were placed in rows on a baking sheet, usually without touching, so the breading could crisp. Some instructions called for turning them during cooking. Whether that happened depended on time, attention, and how many other things were occurring in the kitchen. Homework needed checking. The telephone rang. A younger child wanted a drink. Frozen convenience reduced preparation, but it did not create a silent house or an extra pair of hands. As the oven heated, macaroni provided the dependable center of the meal. Elbow noodles boiled in salted water until tender, then drained in a metal colander that released a cloud of steam. In some homes, the macaroni received a homemade cheese sauce prepared from flour, milk, butter, or margarine and grated cheese. In others, a boxed version offered powdered cheese and faster preparation. Plain buttered macaroni also appeared, especially when the fish sticks were served with tartar sauce or ketchup and the family preferred simple flavours. Whatever the method, pasta made the dinner expandable. A single box of fish might contain a fixed number of pieces, but another handful of macaroni could produce several more servings. The cook could place 3 fish sticks on an adult's plate, 2 on a younger child's, and surround both portions with enough macaroni that the difference did not appear severe. Starch had once again become the household diplomat, smoothing over unequal pieces without attracting attention to the negotiation. The peas arrived with less enthusiasm. They might come from a can, their colour softened by processing, or from a frozen package that promised a brighter green and a firmer texture. Heated with a little butter, margarine, salt or pepper, they occupied the remaining section of the plate. Children often mixed them into the macaroni where they could be eaten accidentally, or pushed them into a small defensive pile. A fish stick could be held in the fingers. Macaroni could be gathered easily with a fork. Peas required concentration and had an inconvenient tendency to roll. Yet their presence mattered to the adult arranging the meal. Golden fish, pale noodles, and green vegetables created the familiar visual structure of protein, starch, and something from the garden, even when everything except the milk and seasoning had arrived in a package. The dinner may have been quick, but the plate still needed to look complete. Fish sticks were especially useful because they reduced the problems that often made children suspicious of fish. Their shape was consistent, their breading was familiar, their flavour was mild, and the bones had been removed during commercial processing rather than discovered unexpectedly at the table. Ketchup could make them resemble another kind of fried food, while tartar sauce gave adults a more traditional accompaniment. Lemon wedges appeared in some households, though not every budget dinner required decorative citrus. The crisp coating supplied the strongest attraction. A stick cooked correctly broke with a faint crackle before revealing soft white fish inside. One left too long in the oven became dry. One removed too early remained pale and flexible, which was not the modern convenience experience promised on the box. The cook still had to judge the oven, especially when appliance temperatures were uneven or the baking sheet had been placed on the wrong rack. The uniform portions also simplified serving. Unlike meatloaf pot roast or a chicken that had to be carved and divided, fish sticks arrived already counted. That advantage could become a problem when the count did not match the number of diners. The cook knew exactly how many were available, and children could perform the same arithmetic from their chairs. If one person received an extra stick, the difference was immediately visible. Macaroni and peas therefore became more than side dishes. They protected the meal from the unforgiving mathematics of the freezer box. Bread and butter might appear as additional insurance. Applesauce, canned peaches, or a gelatin dessert could follow if the pantry allowed it. The fish sticks remained the item everyone remembered, but the inexpensive companions made it possible for those identical golden pieces to feed an entire family rather than disappear in a few minutes. The meal also reflected a broader change in household expectations. Frozen foods promised consistency, speed, and less direct preparation at a time when family schedules were becoming more complicated, and supermarket freezers were offering a wider range of choices. A parent could keep fish sticks available for evenings when dinner plans failed, shopping was delayed, or time simply disappeared. Yet the supposedly easy meal still produced a baking sheet, a macaroni pot, a saucepan for peas, a colander plates, glasses, and silverware that needed washing. The freezer had reduced some labour without removing the evening routine surrounding it. Someone still checked the oven, stirred the pasta, called the family, served the portions, and noticed who had hidden peas beneath a napkin. Convenience had made the main item predictable. Family life remained thoroughly unpredictable. For many people, fish sticks with macaroni and peas became a memory of ordinary school night comfort rather than culinary ambition. The plate was warm, familiar, and unlikely to surprise anyone. The freezer box made fish easier to serve. The macaroni ensured that no one depended entirely on the number of sticks, and the peas allowed the meal to claim a vegetable with a straight face. Fish sticks still exist, but their first decades carried a stronger promise of modernity. They represented a dinner that could move from frozen carton to family table, with fewer difficult steps than the meals that came before. On the next evening, convenience would take another form. Small pieces of leftover chicken and canned tuna would disappear into cream sauce, then be spooned over toast or biscuits, until one modest amount of filling covered every plate. A few pieces of cooked chicken sat on a plate beside a saucepan of white sauce, while 2 slices of bread browned inside the toaster. On another evening, the chicken might be replaced by a can of tuna, and the toast by split biscuits warmed in the oven. Chicken a la king and creamed tuna were economical dinners built on the same useful principle. A small amount of protein could travel much farther once suspended in sauce and spooned over an inexpensive foundation. Toast, biscuits, noodles, or rice supplied most of the weight. The cream sauce carried flavour into every corner of the plate. What might have been 1 or 2 modest servings of chicken became enough for the family when divided into small pieces and distributed through a full saucepan. The finished meal looked rich because it was pale, smooth, and served hot. It also made leftovers seem intentional. Yesterday's chicken no longer appeared as scraps from another dinner. Beneath a blanket of sauce and beside a few brightly coloured vegetables, it had acquired a new name. Chicken a la king varied so widely that many families remembered a method rather than one official recipe. Cooked chicken was cut into small pieces, often from a roast bird, a stewed chicken, or the remains of Sunday dinner. A white sauce began with butter or margarine and flour stirred together over heat. Milk evaporated, milk broth, or a combination was added gradually while the cook worked to keep the sauce smooth. Mushrooms appeared in many versions along with diced pimentos, green pepper, peas or celery. The pimentos supplied small flashes of red in a dish otherwise dominated by cream toast and pale chicken. Some households used canned soup to shorten the process, while others prepared the sauce entirely from scratch. The recipe accepted nearly any amount of chicken because the sauce could be adjusted around it. More milk made more servings. More vegetables filled more spoonfuls. The chicken remained recognizable, but it no longer had to provide a separate portion for each person. The sauce demanded attention despite the meal's reputation for convenience. Flour cooked too briefly could leave a raw taste. Milk added too quickly could produce lumps that resisted even determined stirring. Heat that was too high threatened to scorch the bottom, creating brown flecks and an aroma no amount of pimento could disguise. An experienced cook stirred steadily with a wooden spoon, watching the sauce thicken, enough to coat the back without becoming stiff. The chicken entered only after the base was ready because it had already been cooked and needed warming rather than another long encounter with heat. Mushrooms and peppers might be sautéed first or added from cans depending on time and pantry supply. Salt and pepper were adjusted near the end. The sauce needed enough seasoning to wake up leftover poultry, but not so much that children objected. This was a meal where smoothness mattered both in the saucepan and at the dinner table. Toast made the calculation work. 2 slices could be placed side by side, cut diagonally into points, or arranged with their corners overlapping so the plate looked fuller. Biscuits offered a softer and more substantial base. Noodles or rice could stretch the sauce even farther, especially when bread supplies were low or a larger household needed feeding. The hot mixture was spooned over the centre, softening the toast almost immediately. The edges remained crisp for a few minutes, while the middle absorbed sauce and became easy to cut with a fork. A child who disliked mushrooms might inspect every spoonful before allowing it onto the bread. Another might eat the toast from around the edges and leave the creamed filling untouched in the centre. Adults generally understood the intended combination. The bread was not an accompaniment. It was the part that turned a saucepan of sauce and scraps into dinner. Chicken a la king carried a slightly formal name that made the meal sound more luxurious than its practical construction. Its historical origins have been claimed by several restaurants and cooks, so no single invention story should be treated as certain. By the 1960s, however, the dish was familiar through cookbooks, cafeterias, frozen foods, recipe booklets, and home kitchens. Its name suggested hotel dining or a banquet menu, yet it fit neatly into household thrift. Leftover chicken could return without looking reheated. Canned mushrooms and pimentos added the appearance of variety. White sauce made the dish feel richer than a plain chicken sandwich. It was company language applied to leftover management, and the result often worked. A meal did not need expensive ingredients to sound impressive. Sometimes it needed only a careful sauce and a name that entered the room before the serving spoon. Creamed tuna over toast used the same structure with ingredients that could wait patiently on the pantry shelf. A can opener removed the lid, the tuna was drained, and the fish was broken into flakes before entering a white sauce. Peas were common additions because they supplied colour and stretched the mixture further. Celery, onion, chopped hard-cooked egg or pimento might appear in some versions. The finished sauce was spooned over toast biscuits, noodles, rice, or mashed potatoes. Tuna announced itself more clearly than leftover chicken. Its smell rose with the steam and reached the table before the plates did. For families accustomed to canned fish, this was familiar and comforting. For children already suspicious of tuna noodle casserole, the white sauce did little to conceal the identity of the evening's main ingredient. Still, the dish was warm, filling, and quick enough for a night when time and groceries were both limited. The arithmetic of creamed tuna was especially useful near the end of the shopping week. One can look small when placed in a bowl, but once mixed with several cups of sauce and peas, it could cover a surprising number of slices of toast. 2 cans made the saucepan feel generous without approaching the cost or preparation required by a roast. Flour, milk, and bread were ordinary household staples, each serving several purposes beyond this single dinner. If fresh milk had to be protected for breakfast, evaporated milk or a mixture of milk and water could be used in some kitchens. If the bread was becoming slightly dry, toasting made that less noticeable. Biscuits from breakfast could return beneath the sauce. The meal gathered ingredients that were already available and assigned them new work. Nothing about it required a special display at the supermarket. Its strength was that dinner could begin after the cook opened the cabinet and discovered what remained. Texture determined whether the meal felt comforting or merely soft. Crisp toast provided contrast, but it disappeared quickly beneath the sauce. Biscuits absorbed even more, becoming heavy and tender under the filling. Peas rolled away from the fork unless held in place by the thickened sauce. Tuna flakes distributed more evenly than chunks of chicken, making it difficult to separate the protein from the rest of the meal. This was useful for stretching, though less useful for a child hoping to avoid it. Black pepper stood out against the pale background. A little paprika might add colour. Canned fruit, a lettuce salad, carrots, or green beans could appear on the side, but the main plate remained a study in cream and toast. The dinner rarely photographed beautifully. It was designed for spoons, forks, and hunger rather than admiration. Chicken a la king and creamed tuna have both faded from many regular family menus, though neither has vanished completely. Changing tastes faster, frozen meals, takeout, and less frequent use of cream sauces pushed them away from the weeknight table. Toast is now more often associated with breakfast, while leftover chicken may become tacos, salads, pasta, or microwave lunches. Yet these older meals reveal how 1960s cooks thought about small quantities. Scraps did not need to remain scraps. A can did not need to serve only 2 people. Sauce could distribute flavour, and bread could transform that sauce into enough. The meal's richness came partly from milk and fat, but also from the relief of seeing several full plates emerge from one saucepan. In the next casserole dish, leftovers would be hidden even more completely. Chopped roast beef and vegetables would disappear beneath mashed potatoes, allowing yesterday's Sunday dinner to return with a brown top and a new identity. A covered plate of leftover roast beef sat in the refrigerator beside a bowl of cold mashed potatoes, several cooked carrots, and a small jar of gravy saved from Sunday dinner. None of it looked capable of producing another meal with the dignity of the first. The beef had lost its shine, the potatoes had stiffened, and the vegetables had already appeared once beside the roast. Yet chopped together, moistened with gravy, and covered beneath a thick layer of mashed potatoes, those remains became cottage pie. The name is sometimes confused with shepherd's pie, but the traditional distinction is useful. Cottage pie is made with beef, while shepherd's pie is associated with lamb. In many 1960s American kitchens, however, families were more interested in what remained in the refrigerator than in enforcing British terminology. The casserole's purpose was practical. Yesterday's roast needed to become today's dinner without looking as though the same platter had simply been reheated. Mashed potatoes provided a fresh surface, the oven restored warmth, and a browned top gave leftovers the appearance of a meal planned from the beginning. The transformation started with the beef. Cold slices were chopped into small pieces on a wooden cutting board, along with any usable scraps that had been too irregular for sandwiches. Meat near the bone-dry end pieces and fragments collected from the serving platter all became valuable once reduced to the same size. Onion might be softened in a skillet before the beef was added. Leftover carrots, peas, green beans, corn or celery could join the mixture, depending on what the family had served the previous day. Gravy held everything together, but if very little remained, broth water tomato sauce or a small amount of canned soup might provide moisture. The filling needed to be wet enough to survive another trip through the oven without becoming soupy beneath the potatoes. A cook often judged this by sight rather than measurement, stirring until the meat and vegetables looked coated and the pan no longer seemed dry. Nothing entering the skillet was especially impressive. The skill lay in making the pieces stop looking separate. The mashed potatoes required their own revival. Cold potatoes could be difficult to spread, especially if they had been beaten firmly during the first meal. A little milk, butter, margarine, or warm broth softened them enough to move beneath a spoon. If the original dinner had not left a large quantity, another potato or two could be boiled and mashed into the bowl. This was where the casserole gained most of its size. The beef filling might be shallow, but the potato layer could be thick enough to make every serving feel substantial. It was spread from edge to edge, sealing the meat beneath it. Fork lines were sometimes drawn across the surface, creating ridges that browned more deeply in the oven. A few dots of butter or margarine encouraged colour. Some cooks sprinkled on cheese paprika or breadcrumbs, though the plain version needed little decoration. The mashed potato top performed both practical and emotional work. It protected the filling from drying, stretched the meal, and hid the visual evidence that dinner had begun, as several mismatched containers from the refrigerator. Once the casserole entered the oven, the kitchen filled again with the smell of beef onion gravy and browning potatoes. The edges began to bubble first, sending small streaks of sauce upward around the pale topping. The ridges darkened, and the centre became hot enough that serving it immediately could punish an impatient mouth. Cottage pie was easiest to portion after resting for several minutes, but hungry families did not always respect structural requirements. The first serving might collapse slightly as the spoon cut through the potatoes and lifted the filling beneath. Later portions held together more neatly. On the plate, the dish needed few companions because meat, vegetables, gravy, and potatoes were already present. Bread might still appear, as bread often did, along with canned fruit pickles or a simple salad. One generous square or spoonful looked like a complete dinner. No one needed to count pieces of roast because the beef had been chopped and distributed throughout the pan. The potatoes carried the visual weight, while the gravy ensured that even a small piece of meat flavoured the entire bite. The economy of cottage pie was not merely that leftovers were reused. It was that the second meal felt different enough to prevent the family from experiencing it as punishment. Reheated roast slices could become dry, and a smaller platter made the reduction from Sunday obvious. Cottage pie disguised both problems. Chopping reduced toughness. Gravy restored moisture. Vegetables that might have looked tired on their own became part of a savoury filling. Potatoes concealed the uneven quantities beneath them. This mattered in households where one roast was expected to produce sandwiches, hash soup, and another dinner before its usefulness ended. Waste was not simply discouraged by lectures. It was prevented through recipes that gave yesterday's ingredients a new shape. The cook supplied time and imagination in place of another trip to the butcher counter. The family received a casserole with a browned top rather than a plate of diminishing leftovers. The transformation could be so complete that children who complained about reheated beef accepted the same meat readily once it arrived beneath mashed potatoes. Not every household used the name cottage pie, and many American recipe cards labeled similar dishes shepherd's pie regardless of the meat. Others called the result meat and potato casserole, leftover beef pie, or simply dinner. The ingredients also changed according to family background and pantry supply. Some versions used ground beef instead of roast. Others included tomato-creamed vegetables or a layer of canned corn. Families with roots in Britain or Ireland might follow a more recognisable cottage pie tradition, while other cooks assembled the casserole from magazine suggestions or personal habit. The important historical point is not that one exact recipe appeared everywhere. It is that covering chopped meat and vegetables with potatoes offered a reliable way to extend cooked beef. The method crossed household boundaries because it answered a common problem. A roast was too valuable to serve only once, but its later appearances needed enough change to keep the table interested. Cottage pie revealed the deeper talent behind many cheap 1960s dinners. The budget was stretched not only at the supermarket, but after every meal when someone examined what remained and decided whether it could become tomorrow's supper. The casserole dish gave that decision a physical form. Beneath the potatoes were scraps, uneven portions, and vegetables that had already completed one shift. Above them was a smooth surface ready to brown into something new. The dish respected the cost of the original roast without pretending the second dinner was identical to the first. It also respected the family's desire for variety, even when variety had to be created from the same ingredients. By the time the spoon scraped the final corner of the pan, Sunday's beef had fed the household again. The next leftover transformation would begin with a different centerpiece: several pieces of ham, a bowl of milk sauce, and thinly sliced potatoes layered until a small amount of meat seemed to appear throughout an entire casserole. A few slices of leftover ham did not look like enough meat for another family dinner, especially after the best pieces had already been served hot beside potatoes, vegetables, and bread. Yet once those slices were cut into small squares and scattered between layers of potatoes, their flavour seemed to appear everywhere. Scalloped potatoes with ham turned one of the kitchen's most dependable starches into a deep casserole that could feed several people from a surprisingly small amount of meat. The potatoes supplied nearly all the volume. Milk, flour, onion, and cooking fat became a pale sauce that carried the ham's salty, smoky taste from one end of the dish to the other. By the time the casserole emerged from the oven with bubbling edges and a browned surface, no one needed to see a large slice of ham on the plate. Small pieces had been distributed through every serving. The original ham had already completed one important dinner. This casserole asked it to work again. Preparing the potatoes required time, even though the ingredient list was simple. Each potato was scrubbed, peeled, and cut into thin rounds with a kitchen knife or hand slicer. The slices needed to be reasonably even so they would soften together in the oven. Pieces that were too thick could remain firm while the surrounding sauce bubbled impatiently. Very thin pieces might dissolve into the casserole before the center finished cooking. The work produced a growing stack of pale circles on the cutting board, and a bowl of cold water nearby to prevent them from darkening. Onion was sliced just as carefully, although children who objected to visible onion often inspired finer chopping. The ham required less ceremony. Leftover slices, end pieces, and small scraps were diced into pieces just large enough to be noticed. A cook might reserve several attractive cubes for the top, allowing the casserole to advertise more meat than it actually contained. The sauce could be prepared in a saucepan with butter or margarine, flour, milk, salt and pepper. Flour cooked briefly in the fat before milk was added little by little, while a spoon or whisk worked to prevent lumps. Other cooks assembled the dish more directly, layering potatoes with flour, seasoning onion, and small dots of fat before pouring milk over everything. Both methods depended on the oven to complete the transformation. The sauce had to be generous enough to cook the potatoes and keep them moist, but not so abundant that the finished casserole resembled soup. Ham contributed salt, so seasoning required caution. A cook who salted the sauce before considering the meat could discover the problem only after the dish had baked for an hour. There was no easy correction then except another serving of bread, a glass of water, and a family agreement not to mention it. The layers created the illusion of abundance. Potato slices covered the bottom of a greased glass enamel or metal baking dish. Onion and ham were scattered across them, followed by sauce and another layer of potatoes. The pattern continued until the dish was full, or the ingredients were gone. Cheese did not automatically belong in scalloped potatoes, although some households added it, and others used the terms scalloped and au gratin almost interchangeably. A traditional cheese-free version depended on milk sauce, onion, and ham for its flavour. A cheese-topped version added richness and a darker crust, but also increased the grocery cost. Whatever the method, the final potato layer concealed how little ham might be underneath. From above, the dish looked complete and generous. Only the cook knew that the meat had been placed with careful strategy, spread widely enough that nearly every spoonful would reveal at least one pink piece. Baking was the least active stage and often the longest. The casserole entered the oven covered so the potatoes could steam and soften. Then the cover might be removed near the end to encourage browning. Milk sauce bubbled around the edges, occasionally spilling onto the oven floor if the dish had been filled too enthusiastically. The smell of onion, warm milk, potatoes, and ham moved through the house, slowly creating the impression of a substantial meal well before the potatoes were tender. Testing required a knife inserted into the center. If it met resistance, the family had to wait. The top could look perfectly browned while the middle remained determinedly raw, one of the casserole's less charming habits. Experienced cooks knew that appearance was not evidence. The potatoes decided when dinner was ready, and potatoes did not respond to pleading. Once baked, the dish needed several minutes to settle. Served too quickly, the sauce ran across the plate and the layers slid apart. After a short rest, a wide spoon could lift a heavy portion, containing soft potatoes, translucent onion creamy sauce, and scattered ham. Green beans, cabbage, peas, or a simple salad might accompany it, but the casserole was substantial enough to serve as the main event. Bread often appeared because bread was difficult to exclude from a family table, even beside a dish made almost entirely of potatoes. Children searched for ham pieces, sometimes moving potatoes aside to confirm that the serving contained a fair amount. Adults understood that fairness was measured less by the number of cubes than by whether everyone left the table full. The ham supplied the flavour, the potatoes supplied the dinner. Leftovers from the casserole were useful, although their texture changed overnight. The sauce thickened and the potato layers became firmer, allowing cold portions to be cut more neatly than the fresh dish. Reheating restored softness, especially with a small splash of milk added around the edges. A remaining square could become lunch for one adult, while several pieces returned as another family supper, beside fresh vegetables or eggs. The casserole was already a second life for the ham, so serving it again gave the original purchase an impressive reach. First the ham appeared in full slices, then its bone-flavoured beans or soup. Small pieces entered scalloped potatoes. Nothing needed to look like the previous meal. Each transformation changed the texture, shape, and supporting ingredients while preserving the flavour of the meat. Scalloped potatoes with ham captured the difference between simply saving leftovers and knowing how to use them. The refrigerator could preserve food, but household skill gave that food another purpose. Someone sliced the potatoes, judged the sauce, distributed the ham, and waited for the centre to soften. The result was inexpensive because potatoes and milk carried most of the volume, not because the meal required no effort. It looked generous because a deep baking dish provided height, and because the few pieces of ham had been made visible in many places. By the end of dinner, the platter that once held a large ham had been reduced to memories of bone, and perhaps no usable meat at all. Yet the family had eaten from it several times. One final dinner on this list would complete the same lesson with beef. The last scraps of Sunday roast, several cold potatoes and an onion would meet in a hot skillet, where nothing useful would be allowed to disappear. A cast-iron skillet waited on the stove beside a plate of cold roast beef, several cooked potatoes, half an onion, and a jar containing the last spoonfuls of Sunday gravy. By themselves, the leftovers looked uneven and insufficient. One slice of beef was too small to divide fairly. The potatoes had lost their soft, steaming appeal. The gravy had thickened into a brown gel beneath its lid. Chopped together and browned in the skillet, however, they became leftover roast hash, the 30th and final dinner on this list. An egg could be cracked over each portion, when the household had enough, its yolk running into the browned potatoes and meat. The dish was not designed to conceal that it came from leftovers. Hash celebrated the fact. It took the final useful pieces of a roast and gave them crisp edges, fresh onion, and enough new texture to feel like another meal rather than the diminishing end of an older one. The preparation began with the knife. Cold beef was chopped into small pieces including dry edges, fatty scraps and bits too irregular to become sandwiches. Cooked potatoes were cut into cubes roughly the same size, though perfect uniformity was unnecessary. Onion was diced and added generously because it was inexpensive, flavourful, and especially good at making reheated food smell newly cooked. Some families included leftover carrots, turnips, cabbage, or other vegetables from the roast pan. Others kept the hash almost entirely beef and potatoes. The proportions depended on what remained. If there was very little meat, the potatoes became more numerous, and the beef was chopped more finely. If the refrigerator held only one potato, bread biscuits or eggs might help complete the meal. Hash did not begin with a fixed recipe. It began with an inspection. The cook opened containers, lifted foil, and decided what could still be made useful. Fat warmed in the skillet before the ingredients went in. Bacon drippings, butter, margarine shortening, or fat saved from the roast itself might coat the pan. Onion entered first in some kitchen, softening until sweet and translucent. In others, everything was added together and pressed firmly against the hot surface. That pressure created the crust. The mixture needed to remain undisturbed long enough for the bottom to brown, even though the temptation to stir was strong. Turned too often, hash became warm leftovers. Left alone for the right amount of time, it developed crisp patches around soft potatoes and tender pieces of beef. A metal spatula scraped beneath the browned layer and turned it in sections. The sound against the skillet was sharp and familiar. So was the smell onion beef potatoes and hot fat combining into something that seemed far removed from the cold containers that had entered the kitchen. The saved gravy could be used in several ways. A spoonful stirred into the hash added moisture and carried the roast's original seasoning through the potatoes. Too much, however, softened the crust, so some cooks warmed the gravy separately and served it over the finished plate. Others left it out entirely and relied on ketchup hot sauce or a runny egg yolk at the table. Eggs made the meal feel especially complete. Small wells could be pressed into the hash before eggs were cracked directly into the skillet and covered until the whites set. More often, eggs were fried separately and placed on top of individual servings. One egg transformed a mound of potatoes and scraps into a recognizable dinner with its own centerpiece. When eggs were expensive or needed for breakfast, the hash stood alone. It was still filling, still hot, and still capable of carrying the family through one more evening without another package of meat. Serving hash required less ceremony than carving the original roast. The skillet might be placed directly on the table, protected by a trivet, while portions were lifted with a wide spoon or spatula. Toast biscuits or sliced bread appeared beside it, ready to collect gravy or egg yolk. Canned fruit, applesauce, pickles, or a simple vegetable might provide contrast. The best servings contained a balance of crisp edges and softer pieces from the center. Children sometimes searched for visible cubes of beef, while adults understood that the potatoes had earned equal importance by the third appearance of the roast. There was no need to pretend everyone received the same amount of meat. The pieces had been chopped too finely for accurate counting. Hash made equality easier by turning the leftovers into one shared mixture. Like goulash, gravy, soup, and casseroles before it, the skillet distributed flavour more successfully than it distributed expensive ingredients. This final dinner reveals why so many cheap 1960s meals depended on more than low prices. Their economy came from a sequence of decisions. A whole chicken became broth and dumplings. A ham became slices, soup, beans, and potato casserole. Ground beef disappeared into oats, macaroni, rice, gravy, and bread. Tuna travelled through noodles and white sauce. Tough beef became stew pot, roast cottage pie, and finally hash. Each meal asked someone to plan ahead, save drippings, wrap leftovers, protect milk for breakfast, and remember what was waiting behind the refrigerator door. The grocery bill mattered, but so did time, storage, fuel equipment, and the patience of the person doing the cooking. These dinners were inexpensive because ordinary ingredients carried much of the weight. They were possible because household labor connected one meal to the next. The meals also varied enormously. A family in Louisiana might remember red beans and rice as a regional tradition rather than a budget substitute. A Midwestern household might recall tuna casserole, goulash, and meatloaf appearing in regular rotation. Immigrant families brought cabbage rolls, rice dishes, bean pots, and methods of stretching meat that carried histories far older than the 1960s supermarket. Rural households, city apartments, black families, white families, working-class homes, and larger middle-class kitchens did not share one identical table. Some had freezers filled with convenience foods. Others relied more heavily on gardens. Local markets preserved foods or recipes passed through generations. The title promises 30 dinners, but no list can represent every American kitchen. What connects these meals is not that everyone ate them. It is that many households face the same question each evening. How do you turn what is available into enough? By the end of the decade, packaged foods, frozen dinners, expanding supermarkets, and changing work schedules were reshaping the answer. In later years, microwaves take out smaller households, and new expectations about food would move many of these dishes away from the weekly table. Some never disappeared. Meatloaf, macaroni, and cheese beans, stew, and fish sticks still return in updated forms. Others survive mostly in community cookbooks, family recipe boxes, and memories attached to one particular kitchen. Their importance was never measured only by taste. A casserole might recall a tired parent feeding 6 people before payday. A pot of soup might bring back a winter window clouded with steam. A skillet of hash might recall the rule that nothing from Sunday dinner was wasted until every useful scrap had completed its work. So perhaps the most meaningful object on this list is not the meatloaf pan, the tuna can, or the freezer box. It is the serving spoon scraping across the bottom of a dish and finding just enough for one final plate. These meals were simple, although the thinking behind them was not. They reflected budgeting adaptation, regional knowledge, family preference, and the quiet creativity of people who could make a pound of meat, a sack of potatoes, or a ham bone carry more responsibility than its appearance suggested. Some of the food was delicious. Some of it required generous gravy and determined parenting. All of it belonged to the daily work of keeping a household fed. And when the skillet was finally empty, the recipe card returned to its box, the paper grocery bag was folded for another use, and someone was already thinking about what tomorrow's dinner could become.